A college town, a paradise for young people. Everywhere, students are studying for exams, hanging out with friends, going on dates and throwing house parties, fully immersed in life. But what happens when a predator hides in the shadows, ready to steal away everything you've worked so hard to build? Today's case is a bit unique because I'm not going to be focusing on one or two, but three women who were targeted by pure evil. Someone who was intent on getting what they wanted and leaving destruction in their path. First, I want to go back in time to introduce you to the beautiful, vibrant, and lovable Jamie Glenda Hart. Jamie was born on November 14, 1977 in Normandy, Missouri. It's one of the suburbs of St. Louis, a large metropolitan area in Missouri. Her parents are James and Lana Hart, known to friends as Jim and Donna. Donna already had two girls with her previous partner, who also lived in the St. Louis area. Jamie's older sisters were Victoria, who went by Vicky, and Lisa. It can be really tough to adjust to both of your parents having new partners, but for Vicky and Lisa, it was such a blessing to have a younger sister. Jamie spent the first years of her life surrounded by loved ones in St. Louis, and only a few years later, Donna welcomed another bundle of joy. Catherine, known to everyone as Katie. She was the youngest of the bunch, and since Jamie and Katie were close in age, they became inseparable. The entire family decided to move to Baytown, Texas, which is a small city with a population of about 88,000 people, just east of Houston. It's known for its oil and gas jobs through Chevron and ExxonMobil. There was a huge boom in oil in the 90s, so a lot of families moved there to obtain jobs in the oil industry. It's also super kid-friendly, close enough to the Bay for beach days, and close enough to Houston for shopping, good restaurants, and nightlife. Jamie spent elementary school and high school working hard to get good grades and going to church every Sunday at the Cedar Bayou Baptist Church. She was incredibly intelligent and one of those very naturally independent, hard-working people. Jamie was one of those people truly set on making the world a better place. As she got older, her sisters grew up, went to college, and got married. Of course, Jamie dreamed of getting out of Baytown. Her older stepsister Vicky stayed in Baytown and got married to a man named Eric Harris, with whom she had kids. Her other stepsister Lisa moved to Seattle, Washington. Jamie went to high school at Robert E. Lee High School and spent most of her 4 years in French club and the drum and bugle corps. They performed all over the place, even at Disney World and the Orange Bowl. By the time she was a senior, several of her friends were applying for their associate degrees at Lee College and Houston Community College, but not Jamie, because she wanted to go to a state school. Jamie got into two schools, the University of Texas and Texas A&M. Now, she had to choose. She had to decide. The University of Texas gave her a generous scholarship, which she was pretty excited about, but then there was Texas A&M, and that had been her dream school for years. Not only did it have an excellent biomedical engineering program, which is what she wanted to go into, but the school spirit was unmatched. I didn't know much about Texas A&M, so let me tell you, it starts with the traditions. Football is huge. The fans will stand throughout the entire football game in solidarity with the players. There are yell leaders who are in charge of chanting at every game, and they even have an annual midnight yell practice. Fraternity and sorority life is huge. It's the South, and it's a big tradition in many families. I haven't even gotten started on their sort of obsession with class rings. Do you remember class rings? I got suckered into buying one when I was in college. They are a bit overpriced, but for many people, there's something very special and memorable about them. They signify their accomplishments, especially for students at Texas A&M, who are referred to as Aggies, representing A&M's agricultural roots. The A&M in Texas A&M's name stands for agricultural and mechanical, and these class rings encompass the college experience. You can actually identify any Texas A&M alumni by their ring. Jamie wanted, more than anything, to be part of the Aggie community. Not only was it a lot of fun, but once you were part of the Texas A&M family, you got to participate in all of their ceremonies, so it was an easy decision. Jamie felt that Texas A&M was where she was meant to be. She was so excited when she went to her freshman orientation with her dad. Texas A&M is located in an area called College Station, which is about 2 hours away from Jaimie's home in Baytown. Of course, she was going to miss her family, but now she'd gotten her first taste of freedom. She told her dad she would never move back home to Baytown. College Station was the place to be. In the late 90s, when Texas A&M was first founded in the 1800s, College Station wasn't even really a town. It was just a train stop, and it got that name, College Station, because that's what it was, a train stop at a station located to the west of the campus. But in 1996, when Jaimie started her freshman year, it had grown so big that it touched the nearest city of Bryan. Both towns had a population of around 60,000 people, so combined together, Brazos County was a decent-sized metropolitan area. Today, because so many alumni and football fans have stayed in this area, College Station has a population of a whopping 120,000 people, including the students, and the city of Bryan has a population of 90,000. So it's safe to say there are a lot of people either going in and out of these towns or living there. When the students are gone, College Station and Bryan are ghost towns, but when they're present, the area comes alive. It's a college town in every sense of the word and has been dubbed Aggie Land, a safe, fun area with coffee shops, events like farmers markets, art shows, and fraternity and sorority members going on dates, partying, going to local bars. Think of a college town. That's exactly what it's like. For the first 2 years that Jaimie was in college, her father actually helped her out with her housing expenses and her tuition. They were super close. They would call each other every day, and Jim would even drive to College Station regularly, and Jaimie would come home for holidays and even parts of her summer break. She would tell her family all about her new friends and eventually her new boyfriend, Chuck Cruz. When Chuck laid eyes on Jaimie for the first time, it was like love at first sight. He was head over heels. He described it as if it were the Wizard of Oz. Everything was completely black and white, and then, all of a sudden, when he saw Jaimie for the first time, his world was in full color. Chuck was 3 years older than Jaimie, but that was a good thing because it meant that he was a little more mature. Still, he was a little shy, nerdy, but very smart with a stable job. He had long hair at the time, which definitely set him apart from the cowboy-type guys in fraternities. She and Chuck started dating pretty soon after they met, and before they knew it, they were in a very serious relationship. Jaimie ended up introducing Chuck to her parents. Jaimie did have a lot of boyfriends in high school, and in her first couple of years of college before meeting Chuck, there was no lack of men trying to get her attention. She was what many would think is the epitome of a Southern girl, with the bright blonde hair, the big white smile, and the sparkling blue eyes. She also loved fashion. She was always wearing something stylish, like long, dangling earrings. And as a friend, Jaimie was loyal, outgoing, and had a great sense of humor. She got along with everyone, but she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. She was honest, almost to a fault. She would say anything that came to her mind. When she went through breakups, there was actually rarely any drama. She remained friends with all her exes. She never really thought of any of her exes as having bad intentions. She still valued them as people, they just weren't right for her. But that didn't mean they couldn't remain in her life as friends. Chuck was convinced that he was going to stick it out for the long haul and that they would be together forever. Junior year, college bills were starting to catch up, and Jaimie no longer had the support of her father. This was because Jaimie's younger sister, Katie, was now in college, so Jim was trying to help her out as the youngest daughter. That meant Jaimie was on her own, so she decided it was time to take a break from her studies to work and save up some money. The summer before her junior year, she had decided to find a place where she could live and split the rent with roommates. She chose a cute little 2-story, 3-bedroom townhouse on a quaint cul-de-sac, only 6 minutes from A&M, at 701 Chalet Court on the corner of Welsh Avenue. She would get her own room and share the house with 2 roommates. They were both guys. Their names were Jake Carr and Cody Lemons. When Jaimie first signed that lease for the year, she had every intention of continuing her classes. However, it didn't take long for her to realize, like many of us do when we become adults and take on a lot of responsibilities of our own, that she was finding it hard to pay both her rent and her tuition. So midway through her junior year, Jaimie had to put A&M on hold. It was the spring of 1999, when Jaimie would have been in her second semester of her junior year. Instead, she was now working full-time as a delivery driver for Papa John's Pizza. Now, just because Jaimie had taken a break from her studies did not mean she'd given up on her dream of becoming a biomedical engineer. She was still keeping up with all of her readings that the professors had assigned to her friends who were still in their engineering classes. Jaimie wanted that Aggie ring. It was just going to have to be postponed until she could make ends meet. Working at Papa John's was actually a nice brain break for Jaimie, and she really liked it there. Her co-workers were all around her age, 21, and many people make friends where they work in the restaurant industry, especially so. When Jaimie wasn't already hanging out with Chuck, she spent a lot of her time with her co-workers. After work, they would go out on the town, grab a bite to eat, or go watch some movies until the early morning hours. She was a night owl. She liked to stay out and stay up late. I want to take you to April 30th of that year, 1999. Jaimie had a normal day at work. She delivered pizzas all over College Station and parts of the neighboring city of Bryan until her shift ended a little after midnight on May 1st. One of her co-workers invited her to go watch movies with him after their shift got done. I'm going to call him Adam for the purposes of the story. Adam lived at Pierre Place, a 6-minute drive from Jaimie's house, and this was completely not unusual. As I mentioned before, Jaimie was close with her co-workers, guys or gals, and this would have been typical for her. Jaimie went over there, they hung out, watched a movie or two, and she left Adam's house at 4:30 in the morning. She liked to stay out late. This was normal for her, especially when she didn't have a shift the next day. She walked outside of Adam's place, hopped in her light blue 1987 Chevy Celebrity, and took off for home. Remember, this was 1999. Only about 20% of people owned a cell phone, and even then, I'm sure you will remember they were those big clunky Nokias. There was no text me when you get home. No one had a clue that when the sun came up, Jaimie would be missing. Early the next morning, Saturday, May 1st, Jaimie's roommates were starting to get worried. They had not seen her car parked outside, which meant she hadn't come home the night before. At first, they thought maybe she spent the night at Chuck's without telling them, but Jaimie always let someone know about her plans. Everyone assumed Jaimie would be back home after movie night at Adam's. Jaimie's roommate Jake called Chuck and asked, "Did Jaimie stay at your place last night?" Chuck was getting ready for work by that time, and he said no, he'd been alone most of the night. Then Jake asked if Chuck knew where Jaimie was. Chuck said he had no idea. He hadn't seen her at all on April 30th or even the day before, on April 29th, for that matter. They hadn't talked that whole time, and I couldn't help but think that was a little suspicious. I think Jake thought that too. They were in a serious relationship, so they would go a couple of days without talking. But either way, Chuck sounded concerned. He told Jake if Jaimie didn't turn up soon, they should actually call the police. Even though it was a Saturday, Chuck had work, so he hung up and got on his way. The thing is, around 7:15 that same morning, the Brazos County Sheriff's Department received a distraught call from a woman who said that she was on her routine daily early morning jog when she saw what appeared to be the lifeless body of a woman lying in a ditch at the side of the street just outside the city of Bryan, about 9 feet off of Old Reliance Road near Highway 6. Officer James Hall was dispatched to the scene. He was a rookie cop at the time, but when he saw what the jogger reported, he knew that this wasn't an accident. Even though this was his very first homicide case, what struck him was how young she was. It was a very disturbing sight, and he immediately radioed for assistance. 5 additional officers showed up on the scene and confirmed his suspicions that this was a homicide. So homicide detective Kenny Elliott was sent to investigate. By the time he arrived, traffic had been blocked and the crime scene had been cordoned off with crime scene tape. He approached and his heart sank. he saw the body of a young woman with blonde hair collapsed in a heap on the ground. He realized why the officers assumed this was a homicide. She was not wearing any clothes, and there was road rash all over her body. It looked like she had been thrown from a fast-moving vehicle. As he got closer, he could tell that she had also been struck in the face and head a number of times. There was blood, lots of it, from abrasions that she had sustained in the fall and injuries to her face and head. At this point, from merely the preliminary examination, it was not readily apparent what caused the young woman to die, but Detective Elliott began looking around the immediate vicinity for clues. He figured there could be some indication of how she had ended up in that ditch. Where were her clothes? Did she have a purse? Any form of identification? Not long after Elliott began to walk around the area, he got a message over his radio that a deputy patrolling on Old Reliance Road discovered something less than a mile away, so he was called out to take a look. When Detective Elliott arrived, he designated this second area as another crime scene. All of the young woman's clothes were strewn across a gravel area at the entrance of a remote oil field. The clothes were not just dumped out all at once. Instead, they were scattered individually in a way that looked as though they had been removed quickly, one by one, in the middle of a struggle. There was a blue t-shirt crumpled on the gravel road that was stretched out at the collar, with some stains on it that looked like they could be blood. There was also dirt all over it. A leopard-patterned bra was lying on top. It was ripped between the two cups. Then, in another pile not too far away, was a pair of blue jeans with the underwear still inside. They had a lot of dirt from the gravel on the buttocks area, as well as the legs, and it appeared as though someone had been dragged across the gravel while they were still on. Right next to them was one brown leather strappy sandal. The other was a few feet away, lying by itself. It appeared there could have been some blood on the clothing, and all of the items were near an overturned, ripped, flowered love seat. It didn't appear to have anything to do with the crime scene. It looked like someone had dumped it there sometime before this, and it was left there to be picked up by a local garbage service, but it hadn't been. All the clothing was collected to be processed for DNA evidence. Detective Elliott noticed there were clear signs of a struggle at the oil field, and that her clothing was removed in the process. It was apparent that she had not willingly gotten back into that vehicle. She had been thrown from it when she was taken to the location where she was found in the ditch. Her lack of clothing was a textbook sign of sexual assault by a male perpetrator. What Detective Elliott didn't know was who this woman was and whether she had been kidnapped by a stranger and dumped here, or whether she had been with someone she knew and something went awry. Then, after the struggle, was she pushed out of the passenger side door of the car, or did she jump in an attempt to escape? The first order of business was finding out this woman's identity. She was transported to the Brazos County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. Meanwhile, Detective Elliott and other members of the Sheriff's Department looked over Old Reliance Road and then into College Station for the rest of the morning. They were hoping to find some clue to identify their Jane Doe. Around 9:30 a.m., they had a breakthrough in the investigation. An abandoned car had been found sitting right in the middle of the southbound lane at approximately 1707 Welsh Avenue. Now, I've mapped the location because I really do like to get a visual of every area where evidence is found. This was a little less than 9 miles away from where this young woman's body was found, but only 3 blocks from Jaimie's townhouse. However, Detective Elliott didn't know the significance of this location at the time, since he had no idea who the young woman was or whose car was left in the middle of this road. It was a light blue, 4-door Chevy Celebrity. The lights were still on, the keys were still in the ignition, and surprisingly, the engine was still running. That would have been a pretty odd sight to see. Both of the front windows, the driver and passenger side, were open just a few inches. On the back window of this car, there was a Texas A&M University sticker across the top, and a sticker from the band Prodigy in the bottom middle of the glass. On the far left, there was a sticker with a red lowercase e. Since it was abandoned, Detective Elliot didn't need a warrant, and they really wanted to get inside because they found what appeared to be some blood on the outside of the car. It was near the driver's side, on the front hood, above the left headlight. That's definitely not a good sign. They believed this vehicle was connected to the deceased woman. Once they were able to get inside the car, they found a driver's license with the name Jaimie Hart and a photo that undeniably matched the description of the woman they had found. They ran the VIN, and it confirmed it was Jaimie's car, so it was taken in for forensic processing. They were able to get Jaimie's address from her driver's license, and that's when it became apparent that this car was found only 3 blocks from her house. At this point, there were so many questions. Was Jaimie a college student? Had she been kidnapped in her own car? Had she been kidnapped from her house, her school, or somewhere she worked? Was this even a kidnapping? With the car's proximity so close to her house, police thought that maybe she had been kidnapped from there or somewhere nearby. The place where the body was found was only 9 miles away, which meant they hadn't gotten far before Jaimie had been attacked. So was there a connection to where the body had been found? These were the things they needed to figure out. They went to Jaimie's front door and met with her roommates. When Jake saw the police, his worst fears were confirmed. His friend, his roommate since August, was dead. He would never get to hear her laugh or her voice again. Jake told the police that Jaimie was very savvy. She was aware and cautious. She would never put herself in harm's way, and was pretty street smart, considering they lived in a college town where murders weren't the norm. So he did not understand how this could happen. When he was informed that they believed they found her and she was deceased, he was in shock. He kept telling them she would have never put herself in a dangerous situation unless she had no control over it. Detective Elliot asked him if she had any enemies, and Jake was adamant that everyone loved Jaimie. Jaimie's other roommate, Coach Cody, said that Jaimie was always happy. She was one of those people that, even if she was having a bad day, she would find a way to joke about it. She always made the best of everything, and they just could not understand how this could happen, especially in their college town. Well, of course, that's what detectives want to know as well. This was not common in a town like this, and they knew that the news would break very soon. It would be hard to keep this tragedy a secret. So, Sheriff Chris Kirk, Elliot's supervisor, called Jaimie's family in Baytown to give them news before they found out another way. It was around 10 a.m. Jim picked up the phone, and his heart broke. His daughter snatched away from him in an instant, and for what? Why would anyone do this? It just didn't seem real. It's a parent's worst nightmare. No one ever thinks they'll be preparing for their child's funeral, and not something like their college graduation or wedding. At this point, the autopsy results hadn't come back, so the police had very few details to share with Jim's family. But knowing that his daughter had been found without her clothing and that her last moments included a struggle and suffering sent Jim reeling. He didn't understand how this could happen, and he wanted answers. He wanted justice. Meanwhile, Detective Elliot had gone to Jaimie's boyfriend Chuck's workplace, and Chuck knew as soon as the police arrived that something bad had happened to Jaimie. He told them that he had been worried all morning, and he explained that he had been in a haze, wondering what had happened to her and why she hadn't been in contact with him. But he held on to hope that maybe she wasn't answering her phone because maybe she had just slept in late at a friend's house. However, when Chuck learned that his girlfriend had been killed, he said he felt like he'd been hit by a truck. He got in touch with Jaimie's father as soon as he found out the news, and Jim didn't hesitate to invite Chuck to drive down to Baytown and spend the rest of the week with Jaimie's family as they grieved together. Jaimie's 3 sisters were there, and they spent the week telling stories about Jaimie and trying to come to terms with this gigantic hole in their lives while they waited to get additional information about her killing. Her sisters remember when Jaimie's mother came home with all of Jaimie's belongings. She just sat on the floor with Jaimie's brush in her hand, crying and crying. When Jaimie's best friend received this news, she didn't believe it was true. She was unable to contain her sadness and shock. She had just asked Jaimie to be in her January wedding. Now, she said through tears, that there would certainly be a void at the wedding without Jaimie there. She called her a wonderful person, and she thought it was really scary that the authorities didn't know who did this, that someone was still walking around out there. To further their investigation, police began to canvass the neighborhood around Welsh Avenue where Jaimie's car was found, and around Shell Court, where she lived, to see if anyone had witnessed a kidnapping or seen someone park that Chevy early in the morning on the 1st. They talked to hundreds of people in College Station, hoping someone had seen something or heard a scream, but nobody said they were awake at the time, and they didn't hear or see anything. Authorities put out a call for tips in the paper, offering up to a $1,000 cash reward, and as usual, the tips came flooding in, which took a long time to process. The autopsy results were not released for quite a while, and in that time, the DNA results came back for the blood on Jaimie's clothes and her car. It belonged to her. However, there were no fingerprints in that Chevy, so whoever had dropped off the car on Welsh Avenue had been careful not to leave a trace of evidence behind, unless it was Jaimie herself, and then the car had been wiped afterward. They still had no clue how it got there. It could have been that Jaimie had made it to that area right near her home after leaving Adams, and for some reason she stopped the car for a stranger, and that person ripped her from the car and put her in their own vehicle, and that's why it was still running. Or maybe Jaimie never made it to this location at all. Maybe the person who assaulted her was someone she knew, and they took her from somewhere else and deliberately left her car right near her house to throw off the investigation. It could also be a mere coincidence that the car was found there. Many students live right in that same area, so maybe it was just abandoned close to where they lived so they could escape on foot and go back home as soon as possible. The investigation seemed to reach a dead end, at least as far as forensic evidence was concerned, until Jaimie's autopsy came back. What they found is heartbreaking to talk about, knowing all the pain that this poor girl went through. It's probably not a surprise, considering we know that she was not clothed, but Jaimie had been sexually violated, and the medical examiner found evidence of semen present on and in her body. She had road rash all over, and most of the scrapes and abrasions were on the back and front of her, as well as deep lacerations on both of her knees. Her skull had been fractured, and her neck dislocated. The medical examiner stated this could have occurred as a result of being thrown from a vehicle onto the road. This led to a brain injury and severe swelling to the point where she developed a secondary brainstem hemorrhage. The fact that the hemorrhage happened meant that she was alive for about 20 to 30 minutes after falling from the car, scared and alone in the dark, somewhere between the hours of 4:30, a man 7 o'clock in the morning. Her death was ruled a homicide, and whatever monster did this to her had to be brought to justice. Detective Elliott still had to wait a couple more weeks to see if the male DNA matched up to any existing criminals in his database, but it was 1999. So of course, there actually wasn't a huge catalog of people back then, but it did still take some time to process. This was the biggest news story. It was at the front of the newspapers in town. Everyone was on edge. Students no longer wanted to go out alone or at all, and everyone was hoping the person that did this was a drifter, someone that didn't live in College Station, and certainly not a fellow Aggie. They didn't want to think that any one of them would be capable of something like this. Detective Elliott began having serious sit-down conversations with all the people in Jaimie's life. Jaimie's roommates had solid alibis when they said Jaimie had been at work that evening. Elliott went to the Papa John's, and it turns out Jaimie had been a lot of places that night. Remember, she was a delivery driver, but Papa John's luckily had a catalog of all the addresses and telephone numbers of all the places Jaimie had delivered pizza on Friday, May 30th. Detective Elliott canvassed all of those locations, hoping someone would see something that they thought was suspicious, or may have seen Jaimie take a wrong turn or something. But Jaimie hadn't stayed in one specific area that long, and most of those people had alibis. It was near finals time, and many students were having pizza study parties where they were cramming for their final papers and things like that. So Detective Elliot took DNA samples from anyone that was willing to give a sample until he felt like he'd ruled out all of Jamie's customers. In terms of Jamie's co-workers, like her roommate said, everyone adored her, and someone had overheard that she was going to Adam's to watch a movie that night. Everyone said that she and Adam had been friends for a long time, and they would hang out frequently after work on a regular basis, so Elliot called Adam in for an interview. This man seemed to be seriously grieving. He told Detective Elliot what we already know, that Jamie stayed at his house to watch movies between about 1 o'clock in the morning to 4:30 a.m. But when Elliot asked Adam for a DNA sample, he refused, and this was a red flag. But I want to point out, it's not that uncommon, especially in Texas. There are actually a lot of people concerned about safety and privacy rights. And since DNA collection was still new, people didn't really like the idea of the government having all of their information on hand. Detective Elliot was understandably frustrated by this. This was the last person who had seen Jamie alive. He was about to become their #1 suspect. Refusing to cooperate with this case is definitely not something you should do, so Detective Elliot decided to follow Adam after that interview. He tailed him in a police car, but at enough distance that Adam would have had no idea. Adam ended up at a local bar called the Fox and Hound, where he drank a couple of beers. Elliot sat in the very back corner of the restaurant, trying to stay undercover. I'm imagining him with a detective hat and a trench coat, with lapels pulled up like Sherlock Holmes, but I'm sure he was just in basic clothing and waiting until Adam left because he was after one thing. As soon as Adam walked out the door, Elliot swooped in and stole the beer mugs that Adam drank out of so that he could get a couple of samples of this guy's saliva. And I'm sure some of you may be thinking that cannot be legal. But guess what? American courts have almost unanimously treated DNA left behind on things like coffee cups and dinner plates as fair game for police without a warrant, even if you're eating at a privately owned restaurant. They have to do what they have to do, and Elliot felt like he was onto something here. He immediately put the mugs in for processing and then focused on getting Jamie's boyfriend Chuck's DNA. Chuck seemed to be in a very depressed state of mind. Jamie's funeral services had been held on May 11th at Cedar Bayou Baptist Church, and she was buried at Sterling White Chapel and Cemetery. Her pallbearers included Chuck, along with several of her ex-boyfriends who had remained friends with her. That's a testament to how much people loved Jamie. However, Detective Elliot knew that even if Jamie was universally loved and had no known enemies, there was still a chance one of her exes or her current boyfriend could have had a motive. He had seen so many cases where the fiancé, husband, or boyfriend ended up being responsible, and he had a bad feeling about Chuck. Maybe it was the long hair, the kind of loner gamer persona, or the fact that most women are killed by someone they know. Whatever the reason, they sat down at the station and Detective Elliot asked routine questions to Chuck. He wanted to know where Chuck was on the night of April 30th and into the early morning hours of May 1st. Chuck replied that he was at his house playing computer games in his room alone. He was introverted, and that was his normal nighttime routine. When Detective Elliot asked if anyone had seen him, Chuck said no. He did have 2 roommates, but they were both asleep by 3 a.m. Here's Chuck with practically no alibi, no proof that he hadn't somehow intercepted Jamie after she left another guy's house. Since Chuck didn't have an alibi, Elliot asked for a DNA and fingerprint sample. Chuck got pretty nervous but ultimately complied. Then they told him to take a polygraph test. And this is where things went a little haywire, literally on the test, because Chuck failed every single question. We don't know what Detective Elliot asked him, but we can assume they included questions like, do you feel responsible for Jamie's death? Do you know who killed Jamie? Did you have anything to do with this? However, most of us know that polygraph test results are not admissible in court because they are not an exact science. They're not reliable. They're merely a tool to elicit more information from a suspect. A polygraph can yield mistaken results due to something like nerves, and we know Chuck was very incredibly nervous. But this was weird. Why was he nervous? Was he hiding something? Elliot didn't know, but he labeled Chuck a person of interest. Chuck expressed a desire to take a second polygraph to clear his name, so they administered another one, and guess what? He failed that one too. Not only that, while being interviewed, he stopped at one point, sobbing, and admitted to the detectives that he had done something terrible. He asked them to pray with him. He never told them what he meant by that, but they assumed it was some kind of confession, so they kept him on their radar, just waiting for him to crack. They also confiscated his computer and tried to look through thousands of gaming records, but from what they could gather, it could not be confirmed that he was playing on his computer that night. Elliot thought it was odd that Chuck admitted he hadn't talked to Jaimie in 2 days leading up to her murder. They searched his home and car, but nothing came back related to the case. Then, Detective Elliot asked Jaimie's friends about her relationship with Chuck, and that's when he learned it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I mean, is it ever, with any relationship? Friends said Jaimie and Chuck had a fight 2 days before Jaimie was murdered. Jaimie's friend said she was unhappy with Chuck that week and confided that she wasn't sure things were going to work out long term. That was definitely interesting news to Detective Elliot. He wondered if Jaimie had ever told Chuck she wanted to break up. Had he been lying? Did they get in a big fight and it escalated? Why hadn't he come forward with this information? This new information led to an additional interview with Chuck. Again, he insisted they were looking at the wrong guy, but he was acting all twitchy and nervous, avoiding eye contact. Detective Elliot was convinced there was something more to his story. He asked about the fight, and Chuck said it wasn't really that bad of a fight. They just argued after they went to the grocery store. But they had had an argument, so Detective Elliot kept pressing and pressing, really treating Chuck like a suspect. Chuck admitted again he had done some things. Remember, he asked the detectives to pray with him last time, so Detective Elliot wondered what bad things. He looked him dead in the eyes and asked, "Was one of those bad things murdering Jaimie?" Chuck answered firmly, "No." After this, Chuck left town for Dallas to be with his parents, and at that point, he retained a criminal defense attorney. Some will say that this is a form of guilt, but I would encourage anyone who is this close to a crime, whether or not they had anything to do with it, to retain counsel. It cannot be considered evidence of guilt in legal matters just because you are protecting yourself. Detective Elliot was convinced that Chuck was their guy. If the two were having issues in their relationship, and Chuck was scared about losing Jaimie, he had a strong motive. It's kind of like, if I can't have her, then nobody can. Detective Elliot thought that it was possible Chuck had gotten possessive and violent, so the sheriff's department was going to stop at nothing to bring Jaimie's killer to justice. They took his laptop, searched Chuck's car, and continued to bring him in for interviews, waiting patiently for all the DNA results to come back. It turns out there were no matches for the male DNA found on Jaimie's body. Not one criminal in their database was a match, not the people she delivered pizzas to, not her friends or her coworker or Adam, and not Chuck. No match. So at this point, you would think that Chuck was ruled out. Well, Detective Elliot said everyone was ruled out except for Chuck, even though his DNA didn't match. That was because he was acting so suspiciously. He had a motive, in Detective Elliot's point of view, no alibi, and he failed 2 polygraph tests. Plus, he said there was just something about the way he looked. His long hair, his stoic expression, he just looked like trouble. But that wasn't enough evidence to arrest him, and this was frustrating for both parties, especially when Chuck decided to hire a defense attorney. Elliot wondered, why would he hire an attorney if he had nothing to hide? Of course, Chuck was frustrated because he insisted he was not the killer, and the real killer was running free. He thought that Detective Elliot was wasting time because of his biases, and Chuck said that he was convinced Jaimie's killer was going to strike again. The sheriff's department processed all of the tips that came in and had a few promising leads. The Chicago police phoned in and said they had arrested someone who claimed he knew something about a Texas murder. But unfortunately, after a lot of questioning, it turned out to be another Texas murder. However, there was one witness who called and said that they had seen someone leave Jaimie's Chevy on Welsh Avenue. They gave a rough description of this guy from what they could recall, but this description didn't match any of the potential suspects that Detective Elliott had interviewed. The witness said that the man was a black male around 5 feet 1 inch, probably in his early 20s, medium build with a bushy goatee and no mustache. He'd been wearing a white t-shirt with short sleeves, white K-Swiss tennis shoes, baggy blue shorts, and a baseball cap. While the sheriff's department had a forensic artist draw a rough sketch of what this man might look like, these sketches are never good. I don't know what it is. Now they're better with the technology. But for anyone watching, I'm going to show you the picture right now. And now I'm going to show you the sketch next to a picture of Chuck. While some of those descriptions don't match up, I'm not surprised why police continued to think that Chuck was a suspect. Chuck had a goatee at the time. He was 24, with a medium build. He wasn't black, but there was just something eerie about the eyes. Or maybe the drawing is just a little eerie itself. The stare just gets to me. Something about the drawing doesn't look human. But did it really look like Chuck? I don't know. Maybe he could have appeared to have darker skin at night. Who knows? Now, it had been a few months since Jaimie's murder by the time the sheriff's department had the sketch and put it out in the local newspaper, including the Bryan College Station Eagle, which serviced the entire county. They were hoping that someone, a friend or family member, would recognize the person in this photo. The newspaper covered a few other unsolved murders from the early 90s, and people started to wonder if Jaimie's murder could be connected to those. But there wasn't enough evidence to go on, and none of the murders seemed similar enough to indicate something like a serial killer. None of the articles led to promising tips. It was mid-August, without much to go on, and months after Jaimie's murder. Detective Elliott figured more eyes on the case wouldn't hurt, so they referred Jaimie's case to the Texas Major Crimes Assessment Committee, the Texas Rangers, and the Texas Department of Public Safety. They were all analyzing the data. Then, Jaimie's friends got together and offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who had more information that would lead to solving this crime. But 6 months after Jaimie's murder, not one arrest had been made, and rumors were swirling around College Station in the town of Bryan that Chuck was the one that had done it. Detective Elliott wanted to get Chuck in front of a grand jury since he was acting more and more anxious over time. Had his DNA results been a fluke? Of course, we know that DNA testing is incredibly accurate, so that was unlikely. Elliott tested over 80 people, hoping for a match, with 0 results. Over time, it seemed like the perpetrator hadn't even been part of the Texas A&M community. After all, Jaimie had been found on the side of the road. Maybe the murderer had just been passing through town, like the residents had hoped. This was wishful thinking. It's always scary for a community when things like this happen, especially in Aggieland, a university town where everyone had school spirit in common. But I'm going to remind you again that Texas A&M is in College Station, while the city of Bryan is so close to College Station that a lot of students choose to live there as well. Since all of this is in the same county, cases found in rural areas, right between the two cities, just like Jaimie's case, are covered by the sheriff's department. However, the Bryan PD and the College Station PD are still 2 separate entities. Sometimes these 3 departments talk to each other, but sometimes they don't, because there are so many calls made for petty crimes. Alcohol calls are typical. Disorderly conduct, being under the influence, DUIs, it's a college town. That means that each department is pretty busy, and having a community of terrified people means you're going to be working overtime. Jaimie's friends were still grieving and hoping that someone would be caught. Her roommate Jake said that learning about Jaimie's death was like sitting on a grenade. It was just so unexpected and brought so much pain and destruction all at once. And it wasn't over yet. Just a year later, in May of 2000, Jim, Donna, and all of Jaimie's sisters still thought about her every day. Just a month earlier in April, they celebrated her life at Texas A&M's annual muster ceremony. It's one of those traditions I talked about, Jaimie wanting to be a part of it when she decided to go to Texas A&M. But you could have never imagined that you would be part of it in this way. Every month at A&M, there's a silent ceremony called Silver Taps, where they honor students who have passed away. Every year there's a huge vigil held for alumni and students, and that's the one I'm referring to that happened in April of 2000, called Muster. All over the world, groups of Texas A&M alumni read out a list of names of students and alumni who passed away, and everyone stands in solidarity and remembrance. Jaimie's family gathered on Kyle Field, and the speaker performed a roll call for the absent. They lit a candle for her, and when her name was called, they said, "We are here." Jaimie would have loved it. She wanted more than anything to be part of Aggie alumni and to be part of something greater than herself. It was graduation season at the time, and over a year had passed without the case advancing. Police were concerned that Jaimie's case had gone cold and they might never find the perpetrator. Even worse, another College Station woman might fall into harm's way if this person decided to strike again. Like Chuck had stressed to detectives, he thought he would. Detective Kenny Elliott was still trying to get Chuck in front of that grand jury, but there still was no evidence to prove that Chuck was connected to the crime. The search of his car didn't lead anywhere, and he actually had been logged onto his laptop in the early morning hours when Jaimie was killed. However, there was nothing confirming or denying he was asleep at 4:30 in the morning. A year after Jaimie's murder, on May 28th of the year 2000, 20-year-old Texas A&M student Kristen Lancaster was invited to hang out at a friend's apartment in the Duane apartment complex in College Station. Duane, the Westside Drive apartments, and Jaimie's townhouse on Shallot Court were all about a 10-minute drive from one another. Kristen didn't know Jaimie, but coincidentally, her brother used to work with Jaimie before she was murdered. She will never forget when Jaimie passed away. Kristen's brother came home from work incredibly upset and scared. The two of them spent the next few months looking over their shoulders, double-checking their doors and surroundings. They couldn't believe a tragedy like this had hit so close to home. They were shocked it would happen in College Station, where they always felt safe. By the time a year had passed, the fear had died down, but all of it was going to come bubbling up again when Kristen pulled up to the Duane apartments. It was like she was living the nightmare all over again. There were police cars everywhere, crime scene tape, ambulances, and people dusting for fingerprints. It was like something you would see on a crime show, and never something you expect to see in real life. Earlier that morning at 4:50 a.m., someone at the Duane apartments called 911 to report smoke coming from one of the units. Firemen Robert Mumford and Leon Moore responded to the call with their fire truck. They figured it was their usual call. Some rowdy college students had lit a dumpster on fire or something like that. This was a very lively area with lots of big college parties on a regular basis. When they arrived, they saw smoke filtering out of a partially open window right next to the front door of an upper-story apartment. Firefighter Mumford went up the stairs and assessed the scene. He was trying to look through that window, but the smoke was heavy and it was dark inside. The window screen had been folded outward. It actually appeared that it had been slashed open, like there had been some kind of break-in. He called down for firefighter Leon Moore and Police Lieutenant Bobby Rogers to join him. When they opened up the door to apartment 52, it was pitch black inside, and the fire looked like it was coming from a bedroom. Lieutenant Rogers pulled out his flashlight, trying to see through the haze of smoke. There was an awful smell coming from the room. This wasn't just a smell of fire, it was a distinctive smell. If you've ever smelled it once, you'll never forget it. It's the smell of death, it's the smell of burning flesh. Once they got inside that bedroom, it was clear there was a fire burning on the carpet, and once they extinguished the flames, they could finally see where the smell was coming from. It was a horrific sight. There was a young woman lying on the floor at the edge of the bed, nude from her waist down and partially propped up. It was obvious that she was no longer alive. Her body had been engulfed in flames. The officers immediately backed out of the room to preserve evidence, and of course, they suspected foul play. Lieutenant Rogers went downstairs to his vehicle to call for backup, and when the College Station police arrived, it was a little after 5. AIM Officer Anthony Conkle walked in and did the initial assessment of what had happened. The young woman was in a sitting position. Her torso was leaned up against the bed, and her legs were lying on the floor, spread apart. It seemed very unlikely that she died in that exact position. Rigor mortis had already set in, and it looked as though someone had moved her there and then propped her up. Her clothes had been removed, except for a t-shirt and socks. The perpetrator had taken a bunch of random items from around the house, all things that they thought might actually be flammable. Things like paper, makeup brushes, pens, and pencils had been put into a metal pen and pencil container, which was set between the victim's legs. This appeared to be used to start the fire. The area between her upper thighs and legs was completely burned. Officer Conkle felt disturbed. He had all kinds of thoughts racing through his head. The culprit had made no move to burn any part of her body other than the area between her legs, so he thought that this must have been sexual in nature, or at least an attempt of some kind. Why else would anyone burn this specific part of someone's body? It was morbid and sickening. Officer Conkle of the College Station Police Department, as well as Officer Jeff Capps, who was assigned to the case, began their investigation of this bedroom. In the bed, they found a pair of blue underwear. It was aggressively torn at the seams, and the waistband was completely missing. They didn't know where it was. Also, this is sad, but they could visibly see that the underwear was covered in fecal material, and they wondered if it had been removed while this person was alive, or if the assailant ripped it off post-mortem to try to hide evidence. Investigators looked at the cuts on that window screen I talked about next to the front door. They figured the perpetrator had cut the screen from the outside, reached through the open window, unlocked the door, and got in. But was it a break-in, or was this a ruse? Had the woman known her attacker and let them into the apartment? This definitely seemed like it was her apartment based on things like her makeup collection and her jewelry. But they looked in the bathroom, and the toilet seat was raised. However, looking around again, towels that looked like they belonged to a female were all the same pattern and thrown across the floor. They were cleaner. The fire alarm had been completely torn off the wall and thrown in the sink. They wondered how long ago this fire had been set. It was really hard to tell. As for the towels, it seemed like this woman's attacker had tried to clean up some fingerprints, because when they checked for fingerprints, they realized this person had been very thorough and had not left much evidence behind. In the kitchen, the contents of the woman's purse had been dumped out, including a wallet and checkbook. They were able to identify her from looking in her wallet. Her driver's license was inside. Her name was Carolyn Casey. She had been murdered and possibly violated in her own apartment. Police determined her car keys and her house keys were missing, but other valuable things in her house had not been stolen and her car was still in the lot. It did not seem like a robbery. It was much more calculated. From what Officer Conkle and Capps could gather, someone had broken into Carolyn's apartment, brutalized her, and tried to erase the evidence by setting the apartment on fire. Also, there were knives missing from a knife block in her kitchen, and when the police searched, they found a knife under Carolyn's bed, which seemed like an odd place for a knife to be. They wondered if this had been used to tear off her underwear or cause any injuries, or if it was the one used to cut the screen. If it was used to cut the screen and it had come from her own kitchen, that's why I said it might be a ruse, because they were thinking this could have been staged to look like a burglary. So they collected all the evidence and continued to search the apartment for DNA. They took Carolyn's body and transported it to the Brazos County Medical Examiner's office for a full autopsy and an official confirmation of her identity. So, I want to tell you about Carolyn Casey. She was an all-American girl born on June 28, 1978. She was born in Lawton, Oklahoma, and her parents, Anita Kennedy Casey and Larry Casey, lived there for the first 8 years of her life. She was the tiniest little baby, and she was so loved by her family. Anita and Larry were hard-working, church-going people, and they loved children. They welcomed their second child, Amanda, into the world a few years after Carolyn, and Carolyn doted on her little sister. They were in each other's corners through thick and thin. Carolyn was 8 when the family moved to Aberry, which is a tiny little town in upstate Texas with a really good school district. She grew up with a few close friends and small classes and went to First Baptist Church with her family every Sunday. When Carolyn was in middle school, the family moved again, and this time they settled in none other than College Station. She wasn't the biggest fan of huge public schools, so she enrolled at Timber Academy for her high school years. Timber is a non-traditional high school where students work at their own pace, and they could personalize their educational experience. It was different from a disciplinary program or a GED program. This was about tailoring each teaching to each student and required rigorous applications to get in. Carolyn excelled in all of her classes, and after she graduated, she began working at the preschool child care center at First Baptist Church in College Station in 1996. She taught classes to preschool-age kids while their parents were at work, and she loved children. It was a great way for her to stay connected with her family and her faith as well. Everyone could tell that Carolyn was wonderful with kids, and she wanted to be a mom someday. They knew she would be great at it. She was such a giver, and just like Jaimie, she didn't have any enemies. She trusted that, deep down, humans were good. 3 weeks before she was found burning on the floor of her apartment, 21-year-old Carolyn had just been hired as a part-time floor manager at Big Lots, which is a discount retailer also in the College Station area, only about 15 minutes from her home. Outside of work, Carolyn had a wide network of friends who loved her, and she was still very close to her parents and her sister Amanda. She was known for her bubbly personality, her laughter, her golden blonde hair, and her pretty blue eyes. Carolyn didn't usually go out to parties and bars. She preferred to stay home, go to work, and keep to herself. But when she did go out, she liked to let loose, and she enjoyed socializing with friends. Now she was dead, and everyone was left wondering how this could happen. Early in the morning on May 28th, after Carolyn's body had been found, her family was notified. Larry, Anita, and Amanda were waking up early, enjoying their Sunday before going to church. That's when they received the call, a call they will never forget. On the other end, Larry heard the words, "Is your daughter Carolyn Casey?" When he replied yes, Officer Jeff Capp said, "There has been an accident and your daughter's dead, a fire, and it's being investigated as a homicide." Immediately, Larry was in complete denial. His oldest daughter, the most responsible and hardworking, killed in a fire at only 21 years old. When Amanda heard the news, she screamed so loud her ears started to ring, and she collapsed. She couldn't believe her sister was actually gone. Anita couldn't stop thinking about those words, "Your daughter is dead." They hoped there was some kind of mistake. It wasn't until Amanda called Carolyn's apartment and the phone just kept ringing and ringing that everything became real. They would never hear Carolyn's voice ever again. Carolyn's parents couldn't believe it. Her mother had to be physically picked up off the floor. They all got into the car to head to the morgue to identify her body, and as they drove, they were silent the entire way. Larry had just spoken to his daughter hours before this. He asked her if she wanted to come home that Memorial Day weekend, but she said she was busy with friends, ending the call with, "I love you," and he said it back to her before hanging up the call with his daughter for the very last time. The police went door to door at Duane Apartments. It was quite a big complex, with several different buildings and a number of units. They wanted to find out if anyone knew Carolyn and if they had seen or heard from her the night before. Now, Yasha Harburg was a neighbor who lived in Carolyn's building, and he told police that he had heard loud noises at Carolyn's between 1:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock in the morning. During that 30-minute period, he heard a thudding sound over and over again, but it seemed to end as soon as it began, so Yasha went back to sleep. This narrowed down the time frame that Carolyn could have been killed, but it was hard to know if the thudding was the sound of a struggle or if that was around the time a man had pulled the fire alarm out of the wall. In less than an hour of going door to door, Detective Cap also learned that there had been a big house party the night before, only 2 buildings away in the same complex. The host was a guy named Chris Hiles. Detective Cap went to Chris's door and interviewed him right there. He said he was a friend of Carolyn's and that she was at his party. Chris explained that on Saturday, May 27th, he invited her to his house to party with him, his roommates, and a bunch of other friends, students and residents of the community. He lived only 2 buildings down from hers at the Dwan apartment complex, so she didn't have to worry about getting a ride home. She could just walk. That night, she planned to have a couple of shots and celebrate her new job. Carolyn walked over to Chris's, but before she knew it, it had been a few hours, and she had had a few too many drinks. Carolyn told Chris she actually felt sick to her stomach at one point, so she was going to go home. He said he saw her leave alone a little bit after midnight. It was the start of summer in Texas. The weather was nice, not too hot, and it would have been a nice night to take a short walk across the complex. It would not have taken her long. Chris was actually pretty helpful. He provided a complete list of all the names of everyone who had attended the party, and he gave it to detectives. They set out to interview each one. In the meanwhile, they told Chris if he remembered anything to let them know. I want to pause to tell you what Carolyn's autopsy results showed. Dr. Jane Garavaglia was the examiner who carried out Carolyn's autopsy, and within just a few days, her cause of death was officially ruled strangulation and the manner of death a homicide. They looked for evidence of sexual assault, but all the tests were negative. She had been so badly burned between her thighs that it was actually impossible to tell if she had been violated. If any DNA evidence had been in that area at the time of her death, it was destroyed. But that didn't matter. They were quite certain they were looking for a male perpetrator. It was clear that something had happened that caused the assailant to burn her in this way. Dr. Garavaglia also said that, quote, "It is very common for people to defecate in their undergarments when they are very scared or at the time of death," end quote. Carolyn had been strangled, which is one of the scariest ways that someone can die. It's very personal and it can take a while. She was likely brought in and out of consciousness. Based on the nature of her wounds, it was impossible to tell at what point she had gone to the bathroom and why. If she was scared, if she had already passed, or if she was sick to her stomach, as she had mentioned to Chris, and had been attacked before she had a chance to make it to the bathroom in her apartment. The medical examiner was able to find DNA evidence on Carolyn's body. As it turned out, Carolyn had fought back, and she scratched the person who attacked her. She had gotten some of their skin and some fibers under her fingernails. These same fibers were also found in her bedroom and on her clothing. Now all detectives had to do was find clothing that matched those fibers and someone's DNA that matched the skin. When police further investigated inside Carolyn's bedroom, they finally found the band from her underwear. It was actually tucked into her bedding. The doctor also determined that Carolyn was already deceased when the fire was started. There was no slit found in her lungs. Some may say that's one good thing, but none of this is good. There was a monster walking among them. 2 days after Carolyn was found, investigators searched the exterior of the Duchin apartment complex to see if they could find any items that might point them in the right direction. In one of the dumpsters, they found towels that matched the exact towels that were in Carolyn's bathroom, and they found her car keys and her house keys thrown away. It's interesting because why would someone take her keys in the first place? In the meantime, remember that 20-year-old Texas A&M student I told you about, Kristen Lancaster, whose brother used to work with our first victim, Jaimie, whose case, by the way, was still open and unsolved at the time this was happening? Well, after Kristen saw the commotion at her friend's apartment complex, she went home to find out what was going on. Over the next few days, she began reading the reports on Carolyn's death in local newspapers. None of the details were released about how she had been killed, but it reminded Kristen so much of Jaimie's case. They had the same color hair, the same complexion, and the Hart family, 13 months after Jaimie's death, was still in the dark about how Jaimie was killed and why. Opening the newspaper and seeing another girl murdered was frightening. They had a bad feeling that these murders were connected, but how? Kristen thought she might know something. No, she wasn't trying to be an armchair detective. Not that there's anything wrong with that, or a web sleuth like we have today. But Kristen was suffering from PTSD from a horrific experience she had back in October of 1999, just 6 months after Jaimie was killed. Seeing all this in the news, and when she pulled up to her friend's apartment, she was taken right back into that scary headspace when she was once fighting for her own life. Kristen Danette Lancaster was born on October 30th, 1980, in Bryan, Texas, where she grew up. In 1999, she was an 18-year-old still living in the area. She went to school at Texas A&M and worked part-time as a server. By her birthday month in October 1999, the years surrounding Jaimie's murder had died down, and many people had moved forward. 18-year-old Kristen felt the same way. She wanted to enjoy the beginning of her college experience. On October 23rd, Kristen's friend invited her to a house party at a Bryan apartment complex on Wayside Drive. It was at the Sandalwood Gardens Apartments at 505 Wayside Drive in Bryan, Texas. It was the weekend, and Kristen seriously needed a break after midterms. When Kristen finally showed up at the house party, music was playing, and people were already a few drinks deep. Kristen's friend, the owner of the apartment, let's call her Jess, was busy chatting with her boyfriend, so Kristen struck up a conversation with a guy that she didn't know, but who was hanging out with everyone. They were both drinking, so they were just kind of exchanging small talk. The guy seemed outgoing and well-spoken as he was mumbling to her about the things that were going on in his life. Kristen heard him mention he was 24, that he had been married once before, and that he was young at the time and had made some mistakes. He mentioned things like not being a good partner to his wife, but now he had found God and was living his best life. Kristen felt refreshed by how open he was. Not everyone can have these deep conversations so quickly, unless, of course, they're under the influence. I'm sure most of us have either seen these kinds of people in person or on TV or in movies, kind of pointless exchanges that in the moment, the person just wants to feel accepted and heard, kind of a confession of regrets, and hoping to get some words of compassion or understanding. Especially considering Kristen was an attractive female, it seemed like this guy was being a little flirtatious, but all very polite. Then, all of a sudden, Kristen's friend, who had invited her to the party, Jess, got into an argument with her boyfriend, and things escalated into a yelling match. It didn't help that they were both under the influence. The party ended immediately. No one wanted to get in the middle of what was happening, so they all called rides to get them home. But Kristen was concerned for her friend. She wanted to be there just in case something escalated and the police needed to be called. So she stuck around and sat outside on Jess's porch with the guy that she had met that night. They kept Jess's apartment door open just a little bit so they could hear what was going on in case anything happened. Meanwhile, Kristen and the guy from the party continued to make small talk. She was more interested in hearing what was happening with Jess, so she was kind of only half paying attention. After a while, when nothing really escalated, Kristen said she didn't want to just sit there and eavesdrop on Jess and her boyfriend's whole argument, but she didn't want to leave either. Well, Mr. Friendly was like, "You know what? It's getting a little chilly. My place is right upstairs. Why don't you come up there? We can hang out, we can talk until their arguing is done, or if the argument gets worse, we can race back downstairs or call the cops." This sounded like a good solution. Kristen didn't want to intrude on Jess's situation, but she felt safe since she wouldn't be that far from her friend's place, and the guy had routinely been making her feel more and more comfortable throughout the night. So they walked up the steps. He opened the door, and then, like a switch was flicked, he pushed Kristen inside. This happened so fast. The guy just turned and slammed the door shut and locked it. Then he grabbed a remote control close to the door that was on a side table, turned on the stereo, and turned up the music to a completely deafening volume. Then he turned to Kristen and aggressively told her to take off her clothes. Of course, Kristen was shocked. She could barely hear herself think, much less hear him over the music. So she thought he had to be joking. And if so, it wasn't funny. She tried to get to the door, but he pushed her away and continued to demand that she get undressed. That's when she realized that something horrific was about to happen to her. She kept refusing, and as she did, the man got closer and closer. Then, when he was close enough, he reached out and wrapped his hand around her throat and squeezed firmly until Kristen couldn't breathe. She was afraid for her life. She thought this was the end and that he was never going to let her go. But all of a sudden, he loosened his grip, and when he did, she screamed as loud as she possibly could. But he quickly reached out and started choking her again. He was so strong, and she was so much smaller than him, that he actually lifted her up by the throat and took her into the back bedroom, and she blacked out. This must have been absolutely terrifying. Now I am about to go into the details about what happened to Kristen, but because I know that some of you may have been victims of the same type of crime, and it can be triggering, if you do not want to hear this, you can skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen. And I'll be as quick as I can. Kristen was incredibly smart and quick on her feet, and her actions saved her. She took every opportunity she could to stall her perpetrator. First, of course, she argued with him, saying that she did not want to take her clothes off. She said, "I'm not going to do it." But he looked at her with these evil eyes and said, "You're going to do it." She knew she had to comply, but when she did, she took off her clothes as slowly as she could. Then, when he was trying to get on top of her, she looked at him and said, "You don't want to do this." He stopped for a minute and was like, "Why don't I want to do this?" That's when Kristen came up with a lie. She told him that she had HIV, hoping that he would decide this was not worth it. He stopped, and she saw him thinking about it for a second, but it didn't work. He looked at her and said, "Well, guess what? I have it too." And then he lunged forward and got on top of her. Kristen then tried to talk to him about God. She asked him, "Is this what you were talking about when you said that you had found God and you were working on yourself?" This actually did make him stop, and he got off of her, at which point she was able to get off the bed and started to stomp loudly on the floor. She was strategically making it look like she was stomping to make a point, like why would you do such a thing? Just stomping the ground, for emphasis. Really, she was trying to alert her friend Jess downstairs, but this set the guy off again, and he began to reach out and touch her sexually. She described the feeling of his hands around her neck again, so tight that she thought the bones in her neck were going to break. When she told him that he might kill her, he said, "Do you think I actually care about that?" So, he did have the intention to end her life. He didn't care about her at all. He just wanted what he wanted. By the way, he calculated his movements, bringing her in and out of consciousness. To her, it seemed like he had done this before. When Kristen blacked out and came to again, he was just starting to unbuckle his belt. She assumed he would hit her with it, but then he got up, told her to be quiet, and ran from the room. At this point, she screamed, "Call the police! Call the police!" over and over again. But to her surprise, the police were already there. It was like a scene in a movie where the main character is too close to an exploding bomb, and their hearing goes out. Everything was fuzzy. Kristen was trying to figure out what was happening. She could hear the voices of the man who had tricked her and several police officers, who she would later learn were members of the Bryan PD. It turned out her friend Jess had called 911, reporting that she heard a woman screaming in the apartment above her. When police arrived and knocked on the upstairs apartment door, they heard loud music, a scuffle inside, and then a woman yelling to call the police. They heard a stomping sound, and when the door was opened, the man behind it was agitated and aggressive to the point of violence. They immediately handcuffed him in the main room, and in the bedroom, they found a partially clothed young woman on the floor, shaking uncontrollably in the fetal position. The police took the man to the Bryan police station for questioning and talked to Jess, who realized that the woman screaming upstairs was her friend Kristen. I'm not sure if Kristen was taken to the hospital then, but I do know that she spent the rest of the night sleeping on Jess's couch and trying to comprehend the traumatic event that had just happened to her. Now you know why Kristen had PTSD, and also why she felt there was a connection between what happened to her and these two women being killed. You may wonder who this man is and what transpired after this attack on Kristen. I will let you know everything, but I want to go back to Carolyn's investigation so I can connect the dots going forward as they began connecting the dots going backward. Remember Carolyn's friend Chris, the one who threw the party she was at? He did reach back out to investigators saying that he had remembered something from that night that stood out to him. He had noticed his upstairs neighbor had left the party before Carolyn. This wouldn't be that unusual, except for the fact that the neighbor came back around 1 a.m. When his neighbor walked in, Chris noticed he smelled terrible. Chris couldn't pinpoint what the smell was, but he said it definitely wasn't BO, it was something else, something rancid. Detective Capps went upstairs to Chris's neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door. Inside, there were two guys, Mike R. and Yobi Matthews. They seemed like ordinary guys, but the terrible smell Chris reported was the best lead that Detective Capps had, so he brought them both to the station to be interviewed. They willingly came and even brought along the clothing they said they wore on the night of the 28th. They each talked to Officer Paul Price. Mike consented to all forms of DNA collection, including blood samples, saliva, head hair, and pubic hair. He gave over his clothes and explained that he had been at the house party the entire time and had gone back upstairs to his own apartment to get into bed before the party ended. Mike said that Carolyn was like his sister. They grew up together in the same town. They saw each other at parties, around the complex, and would even confide in one another about personal stuff. When officers asked if Carolyn had ever expressed romantic interest in Mike, Chris, or Yobi, or if any of them had expressed interest in her, Mike said no. He was trying to look for a motive. Just like Mike, Yobi also consented to all forms of DNA collection, including blood samples, saliva, head hair, and pubic hair. He gave the police a pair of dark blue shorts and a white t-shirt that had the words "Rehab is for quitters" on it. He explained he'd also gone to the house party with Mike. He knew Carolyn from living in the complex. They played basketball together from time to time, and he had seen her at the party that night. He said he recalled talking to her for a little bit, but not that long. Around midnight, he went to a nearby gas station with another woman. He bought a pack of cigarettes there, and then his brother wasn't feeling well, so he went to check on him and then returned to the party, staying until it ended. His brother did confirm that he had been there that night to see if he was okay. Both of these men's stories seemed legit. There was nothing that stood out to investigators, so they were both free to go and get back to their lives. Forensic analysts looked at Mike's and Yobi's clothing under a microscope, and none of the fibers matched up with the fibers on Carolyn's clothing. So what was Chris talking about when he mentioned that bad smell? Was Chris lying? Was he placing the blame onto Mike and Yobi, almost to cover his own tracks? Maybe everyone police interviewed said Carolyn left the party after midnight. She'd been sick, and many of them happily provided DNA evidence. Detective Capps decided to order background checks, and those take 1 or 2 days to process. He decided to go on what he could. If Yobi and a mysterious other woman had gone to a convenience store during the party, he wanted to check it out. Detective Capps went over to the store and requested surveillance footage from between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., and sure enough, there was Yobi and the woman in the video with him. But when he watched the video, Yobi was wearing different clothing. It wasn't the white shirt and blue shorts like he said. Now he was wondering, did he lie? If he lied about the clothes, was he lying about other things? So they went to his apartment once again and requested the actual clothing he had worn that night. Yobi just apologized, saying he had completely forgotten what he had worn. From the video, it seemed to be a black jersey-type shirt with black shorts or pants and a white pair of sneakers. He told the detectives they were welcome to search his entire apartment for the clothing that they thought he was wearing. As they looked, they found a pile of dirty clothes on the floor in his closet, which included the ones that appeared to be in that video. All the while, Yobi was calm. He was just sitting there playing PlayStation and hardly paying attention to the officers. He really didn't seem to care that there was a murder investigation going on. So Detective Capps wondered how drunk he really was at that party, if he could forget what he had been wearing. It sounded suspicious, but they tested Yobi's clothing and lo and behold, there was zero forensic evidence. No clothing fibers, no DNA, nothing. Detective Capps was again at a dead end. But you know those background checks he ordered? They came in that late afternoon, 2.5 days after Carolyn had been killed. He browsed through them at his desk. All the people at the party were your average citizens. No crimes, no outstanding warrants. Except there was an outstanding warrant about a month ago. On May 5th, there had been a misdemeanor trial for a man accused of sexual assault. He was initially charged with unlawful restraint, but had completely skipped out on that hearing. The Bryan police had gone to his previous address at Wayside Drive. Except the guy didn't live there anymore. He had moved halfway through the year and hadn't updated his address with the court. His name was Yobi Matthews. This wasn't enough evidence to connect him to someone's murder, but Officer Capps quickly realized this man had attacked a female before. He wanted to get every detail on this other case. When he looked further into the documents, he realized Yobi had attempted to strangle the woman who accused him of attacking her, and that she reported feeling like she was going to die. That woman was none other than Kristen Lancaster. Yep, the dots are connecting. Was Yobi the same guy that killed Carolyn and maybe even Jaimie? If so, why was he on the street? How did he get away with the attack on Kristen? Anyway, well, back when it happened, which you will recall was 6 months following Jaimie's murder, Yobi was brought in for questioning, and he told a completely different story than what Kristen had told Jess and the police. First, he said nothing happened between them. Nothing. That's a little weird because police said they heard Kristen scream for the cops. So why would she do that? Well, according to Yobi, something did happen. There had been an encounter in which Kristen had told him to stop, but it wasn't a sexual attack. No, it was nothing that extreme. According to him, he said he invited her over during that party, promising to sell her cocaine. However, Kristen didn't have the money, so she agreed to give him a striptease in exchange for the drugs. Well, he didn't mind the striptease, but he told the cops that he gave her crushed-up aspirin instead of cocaine. When she figured it out, she got upset. She screamed, and she was punching him, and they got into a fight because he was shoving her off of him to calm her down. Now, she was trying to claim that he sexually violated her, but he hadn't even touched her. Just in self-defense, he told the cops she was lying. This story does sound far-fetched to me, but now it's 2024 and this was 1999. I don't know if things have definitely changed, and I've always advocated for believing in women in these cases. I have realized how much evil men have gotten away with, but it doesn't mean that women are always telling the truth either. At that point, Kristen had not given her testimony to the police. This was the first story that they were hearing. All of the details lined up. Was it a drug deal gone wrong, or was it something else? Whatever happened, investigators knew that Kristen hadn't been able to leave. Otherwise, she would have been screaming for someone to call the police. Without any hard evidence, they charged Yobi with unlawful restraint, a Class A misdemeanor. It's a serious crime that would require a hearing, but they didn't have enough to actually put him in jail for inflicting harm, and they let him go the next morning. That morning, Jess convinced Kristen to go to the county crisis center, and she met with counselors. Kristen thought that what happened to her wouldn't qualify as anything sexual because the man that attacked her hadn't used his private part, it was just his hands. But they told her yes, what she experienced was an extreme violation of a sexual nature, and she should file a police report so the man would face consequences for his actions. Jess called the police herself. She didn't know that upstairs neighbor, and she didn't even invite him to the party. The guy just showed up, and she wanted him to pay for what he had done to Kristen. When the police told her that he hadn't been charged with a sexual crime, she was outraged. He had almost killed her friend, and he was walking free. She told all of this to Kristen, and Kristen was also very angry and confused, but mostly terrified. She knew she had to go report it herself, and that's what she did. She went with her dad to the Bryan Police Department to give her testimony. Of course, both the police and Kristen have very different stories about what happened. According to police reports, the officer asked her routine questions about what happened that night. They belied Kristen about what happened, but they needed a full testimony, which meant they had to ask her some hard questions. According to Kristen, she felt that the police blamed her. She was hysterically crying. She pointed to her throat and said, "Do you see this bruising?" Her entire throat was all different colors, and she couldn't even swallow. The officer told her to put her own hands around her own throat, and this was to prove she could have choked herself. How would anyone at that level of bruising? I mean, it's obvious, but of course all of that was left out of the police reports, and the department denied that the officer had been that insensitive. Of course, I can't find the name of the person who interviewed her, so we'll never know exactly what happened. So let's just say it was tense and upsetting for both Kristen and the interviewer. The police took photos of the bruising, and in the next 2 months, Kristen came in for multiple interviews to talk about the worst night of her life. Finally, they did charge Yobi with first-degree sexual assault over 2 months later. Now that Yobi was arrested, Kristen tried to recover from the horrific violation of her body and her mind. She quit her job, she tried focusing on herself, and she refused to attend that trial. Instead, she moved forward and just let the justice system do what it had to do. But that probably wasn't the best idea, because here's where things went wrong. When Yobi went to his indictment, he faced a grand jury without Kristen's testimony. Since she refused to face him in court, the jury only had the prosecutor's testimony of what Kristen had gone through and the pictures of the bruising from that evening. Yobi was free to tell his own story. He still called it a drug deal gone wrong, though he did admit to locking the door and physically harming her. But he claimed he'd only hurt Kristen by grabbing her neck right when the police arrived. He said it was a crime of passion, since he knew that he was the one who was going to get in trouble because she would accuse him of everything that he had done to her. I have to tell you, he's a pretty convincing liar. The jury knew that they'd both been drinking at a college house party, and the jury was in a position where there was reasonable doubt about whether Kristen's story was true. So they decided not to indict him due to lack of evidence. The charge was dropped, but he could still be put in prison for unlawful restraint, and the next trial was scheduled for May 5th, 2000. But until then, Yobi was allowed to go back to his life. When Kristen realized that this man had walked free, she felt betrayed, and she was scared that he might track her down and kill her. She didn't cope by isolating herself in her apartment. Instead, she engaged in risky behaviors, like heavy drinking and hanging out with men she didn't know, even getting on the back of a guy's motorcycle after both of them had been drinking. And before you judge, this is very normal for someone who's experienced a traumatic event, and it's very sad that he put her in that position of needing to cope this way. But over time, Kristen did recover. She took up new hobbies like long-distance running, she went back to work, and she even started dating a new guy. Kristen was able to move forward one step at a time. Her grades went back up, she made new friends, and while it took a long time, she had the strength to talk about her near-death experience and express how lucky she felt that the police arrived on time that night. At the time, nobody thought for a moment that Kristen's case was related to Jaimie's murder. When the truth inevitably came out, it would change the way people felt about their community forever. When Detective Capps was looking over all the documents regarding what happened between Yobi and Kristen, he realized that Kristen almost died, and it was from strangulation, and Carolyn had been strangled to death. She lived in the same complex, and he admitted to being with her that night. Detective Capps noticed that Yobi had skipped out on his court date in Kristen's case, so he could arrest him for that. He wanted to get this guy off the streets fast. He was bad news, whether or not he was connected with these other women. On June 2nd, Officer Capps sat down with him for another interview. This time, he had a game plan. He wanted to see if he could put some pressure on Yobi, to see if he would actually admit that he had something to do with Carolyn's murder. The thing is, there was no DNA connected to him found at the crime scene, but he didn't know that. So, Detective Capps told his supervisor to page him with a simple message while he was in the room interviewing Yobi. Just text that the DNA matches in big letters. He sat down with Yobi for another interview, and when he started it, he said, "Any minute now, we're going to have those DNA results about who killed Carolyn. Remember that there was DNA under her fingernails, and Yobi's DNA had been sampled several days ago. It takes weeks for DNA to be matched up in the system, but Detective Capps was banking on Yobi not having any idea how long it took. Also, if he was the perpetrator, he would have no idea that the police had found DNA underneath her fingernails. Remember, the person had made an effort to wipe fingerprints off of everything and then burn Carolyn's legs. He wouldn't expect there to be any evidence left over." Detective Capps was right. When the head of the College Station police paged him with the message, the DNA matches, he asked Yobi to read the words out loud, and that's when he freaked out. Yobi got emotional, broke down, and admitted right there that he had killed Carolyn, but by accident. On accident? After everything that happened with Kristen, when he looked her in the eyes and said he didn't care about whether she died, he was going to say that this was an accident? No, he killed her in cold blood. That was obvious, especially with the way her body was found, only half clothed. The DNA results weren't back yet, but a confession was enough to arrest Yobi for first-degree murder. That's when the police started putting the puzzle pieces together and trying to figure out what happened. Yobi Catherine Matthews was born April 14, 1976, in College Station and jumped around Texas most of his life. He left high school during his senior year, got married, and had his first child at 17 years old. In the next 6 years, he would have 3 more children, get divorced, and work as a cook, a carpenter, a laborer, and a nighttime grocery store clerk. I couldn't figure out if the store that he worked at was Big Lots. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, though, because we know Carolyn had just started working there. Whether he targeted her there, or they just crossed paths because they lived in the same apartment complex, it didn't matter. The connection was made. Here's something interesting. In 1999, Yobi was living at Sandalwood Gardens on Wayside in Bryan with a friend. You know, the place where he attacked Kristen. But his friends and roommates said he left under mysterious circumstances and moved in with another friend, that guy Mike, at Dwan apartment complex. That was in early 2000, but Yobi wasn't on the lease, so nobody in the complex that was in charge of all the leasing papers would have had any idea he lived there or that he had a criminal record. It's so easy to just slide by like that, to just move in with a friend. And wow, did this guy have a long criminal record? In the early 90s, he faced 4 different charges of cruelty to animals. You know that killers very regularly have a history of cruelty to animals, and there are a couple of theories why. There's the graduation theory, where they start with weaker creatures as practice for targeting humans, and there's also the general deviant theory, where they will take out their anger and rejection on animals. It's a combination of both. And animal cruelty often indicates someone will engage in a pattern of violence in the future. In 1993, Yobi pleaded no contest to animal cruelty. He managed to escape prison time and was just put on probation. In 1995, he was charged with first-degree force sexual intercourse. He forced himself on a friend in her apartment while they were drinking. Sound familiar? Yeah, he's done the exact same thing before, and he faced the Dallas County grand jury and pleaded not guilty. That jury chose not to indict him. Just like in Kristen's case, there wasn't enough evidence to sentence him to prison. Another of his animal cruelty misdemeanors happened in 1997, along with a cocaine possession charge. It started off with jail time, but then decreased to 3 years of probation. Yobi's jail time officially ended in January 2000, so this man had received the unlawful restraint charge in Kristen's case while on probation. After all this, how did he get away with so much? I'm shocked that he managed to slip through the cracks so many times. He was a smooth talker, for one thing. One of those people who went out of his way to say hello to strangers and wore like eccentric outfits, funky Hawaiian shirts, trying to act like a cool guy. It was really unlikely that anyone would suspect he was a predator without seeing his records. He was kind of like a gentle giant, but really was quite a big guy who could overpower an unsuspecting woman. On June 2nd, we told Detective Capps the official story of what happened. He said that he and Carolyn had been seeing each other on and off for the last 3 weeks, and weirdly enough, this time frame matched up to when she started working at Big Lots. He said on the night of the party he was pretty drunk and he'd gone to her place around midnight. They'd been messing around, he ripped off her underwear, and then they had consensual sex. But I was thinking, why rip them if it was consensual? I don't know, maybe some people were into that and they were 2 of those people. But afterward, he said they got into an argument about Yobi's younger brother because he was accusing her of flirting with him or something. Carolyn admitted, yeah, she was attracted to him and she could F him if she wanted to. So he called her the B word and she tried to hit him, and that's when he snapped. He strangled her and she just happened to die, but he didn't mean to, and he was scared. He didn't know what to do, so he left the apartment trying to figure it all out. He said eventually he returned, wiped down all of the areas his fingerprints might be on, and then he tried to destroy the evidence. He cut the window screen with one of her knives to make it look like a burglary. And we're expected to believe this version of events? Why not just call 911 if there's really an accident? Because we know he's lying. Keep in mind, Carolyn was sick when she got home. The detectives really didn't think that she would have been in the mood to have an argument with anyone, or even be around anyone. She had just left a social environment, telling her friend Chris that she really needed to go because she was ill. Chris never mentioned Yobi was with Carolyn as a boyfriend, or even seeing her acting like they were a couple, or that they were involved at all, and they didn't leave together. Also, Chris had told police that Yobi was missing from the party before Carolyn left, so he must have been waiting for her to leave and followed her to her apartment. Finally, why would there be female matter in her underwear if they had had sex before she was murdered? Carolyn was terrified. That alone proved the attack was non-consensual. After his confession, Yobi was arrested for Carolyn's murder, and his bail was set at $300,000. I want to return to Jaimie's case so that I can tie things together. Remember the description of the person that someone saw drive Jaimie's Chevy to Welsh Avenue? A 5 feet 11 inches black man in his early 20s. Well, when the sheriff's department caught wind that Yobi fit the description, Officer Kenny Elliott went to question him. Now that I look at these pictures side by side, I can see the resemblance, although maybe the medium-build description was a little vague, and I bet that's why there was a discrepancy with the weight and the face. There's enough of a difference that it makes sense why none of the tips led to the killer. On June 6th, Elliott showed Yobi a picture of Jaimie and asked him if he knew her. He said he didn't, but he did agree to give a DNA sample. This was the 85th sample that Detective Elliott had processed through the system, and remember there was DNA collected at Jaimie's crime scene on and inside her body, sadly but also thankfully, because 17 days after that, all the forensic evidence came back in, and it was official. The DNA under Carolyn's fingernails was Yobi's. The fiber of clothing found on Carolyn's clothes was Yobi's, and a few fibers on Yobi's shirt were found after processing the clothes that matched up with Carolyn's underwear. There weren't fingerprints, but it didn't matter. He was the culprit. As for Jaimie, the semen that was found on her body belonged to Yobi, and Kristen agreed to testify under oath that Yobi was pure evil, that he lured her into a trap and she was lucky she made it out alive. They had their man, or I should say their monster. When Carolyn's parents, Larry and Anita, got the call from Detective Capps saying they had captured their daughter's murderer, Larry asked if he was absolutely sure they had the right guy. Detective Capps's exact words were that he would bet the farm on it. Carolyn's funeral services were held at Covenant Family Church. She was laid to rest in Waco Memorial Park. There was very little relief knowing her killer was behind bars. Not when he had taken so much. When Chuck realized that he was finally off the hook, he wanted to feel relieved, but he had been fighting for his innocence all year in hopes that police would stop targeting him and capture Jamie's real killer. It took Carolyn's murder for the officers to connect all the dots. Another girl had to die for Jaimie to get justice, and Chuck couldn't help feeling that this entire second case could have been prevented. He told them that he thought the killer would strike again, and he was right. And I have to wonder, if this were just one town with one department and not two towns with three departments, would they have captured him faster? Officer Elliott said that if he had to do this case over, he would still focus his efforts on Chuck and not change any part of his investigation. He says that, but he said he genuinely tried his best. 5 weeks after his arrest, when he was presented with all the DNA evidence, Yobi confessed that he entered Jamie's car by force, took her to the oil field entrance where he sexually violated her, and then hit her in the head multiple times. However, he said he didn't kill her, and wouldn't say whether he threw her out of the car or if she jumped. He didn't say where he kidnapped her or if he knew her, so we will never know. But Yobi was charged in Jamie's murder, and his bail jumped to $900,000. At Carolyn's trial in June of 2001, it came out that this man was linked to 7 forced intercourse cases and several attempted ones as well, and somehow there was never enough evidence to convict him. His attorney thought that she would be able to get him out of this if he pleaded guilty. After all, 2 other juries had refused to indict him. But now, murder was involved, and prosecuting attorney Bill Turner presented the cold, hard facts. Several of his targets testified that he would toy with his victims by strangling them and then bringing them back to consciousness. One of those women was Misty Johnson. She had been attacked by Yobi just a couple of months before Jaimie had been killed. She was so terrified that she quit her job, left town, and couldn't believe the man she was able to get away from went on to kill other women. It was hard on her, Kristen, and the other victims. They felt guilty they hadn't done more to put him behind bars. But it's scary. Kristen actually called Jaimie and Carolyn her alternative future. And what she meant by this is that she realized she could have been killed. She remembered opening the newspaper and seeing Yobi's picture in connection to Carolyn's murder, and thinking she wished that she had tried harder to make the police believe her version of events. But I do want to thank her for being so brave and so open about her heartbreaking story. It is not her fault that this evil man did this to her or these other women. He's the only one responsible for his actions. After Kristen testified, she met both Jaimie and Carolyn's families, and they do not hold any grudges at all. Kristen calls herself lucky to be alive. She understands how fragile life is and how easily someone else can take it away. Yobi was convicted of capital murder in Carolyn's case. The jury sentenced him to death. Later that year, he was tried for Jaimie's murder and received life in prison on top of his pre-existing death sentence. In 2001, death row took about 10.4 years on average. That is a long time, but it's all because people try to appeal as many times as possible to reduce their sentence to life without parole. But Yobi decided not to appeal. In his last days, he said he made his so-called mistakes, but I call them choices. Yobi was set for his lethal injection on January 6, 2004, and after that deadly dose of medicine was administered, he whispered, "I love y'all," to his sister and cousin while blowing a kiss in their direction before losing consciousness. He never gave a final statement, and honestly, it does kind of make me sick that he died such a peaceful death after Jaimie and Carolyn died in terror. He also got a final meal of his choice, which is traditional in death penalty cases, and his request was 3 pieces of fried chicken, 1 pork chop, 2 pieces of fried fish, strawberry ice cream, a 6-pack of Coca-Cola, and a pack of Newport cigarettes. The cigarettes were refused for prison policy. But do you think that people on death row should be entitled to a last meal? Let me know your thoughts. The Casey family watched the execution, and they will never get over the loss of Carolyn. She had her whole life ahead of her. Larry, Anita, and Amanda remember how much she adored kids and desperately wished she had been able to get married and have kids of her own. For Jim, LaDonna, Katie, Lisa, and Vicky, the process of seeking justice for Jaimie drained them. Donna said, "We feel satisfaction from the verdict, but it was hard to sit through. We're not vengeful people. I've been praying for 2 years for God to take the hatred I felt for this man from my heart. I had to let go." Chuck says he still misses Jaimie. What he misses most are the little things, running errands and watching movies on the couch. He still remembers that last argument, the one that Jaimie's friends had thought put them on the verge of a breakup. They argued about bread. The grocery store bagger had accidentally put a cantaloupe on top of a loaf of bread and smashed it. Jaimie got upset, but Chuck told her he didn't think it was a big deal, and that's what they got in this petty fight about a loaf of bread. And that's so real. They were in their early 20s. They were stressed out about work, trying to build their life together. I know many of us have had our fair share of dumb arguments. Every year, more college students commit to Texas A&M, more alumni are honored at the muster ceremony, and more people get their class rings. A promising young life, Jessica Kean, a talented cheerleader, singer, and musician, had just begun dating her first boyfriend. But her bright future was tragically cut short when she encountered a monster. Today's case, I would like to introduce you to Jessica Lynn Kean. She was born to Rebecca and James Kean on September 24, 1975, in Columbus, Ohio. She had an older sister named Heather, who was born in 1971. Rebecca and James were doing all they could to give their daughters the very best life possible. James, who went by Jim was only 21 when they had Heather, and Rebecca was only 20. But Jim was ambitious. He was an entrepreneur from a very young age. It started with him having his own newspaper route when he was just a kid. And then he created his own miniature golf course in an empty lot near his home. And he cleverly sold the kids and neighborhood memberships so they could use it. When he was older, he was hired as a stock boy at Warehouse Paint Center. And in those days, many employees were very loyal to their jobs. So he worked his way up, and he was working there when he and Rebecca had their girls. He ended up staying there for 20 years and eventually became the president of the company. Rebecca was in school at Ostendorf Art Academy, studying fine arts and commercial art. And Jim was also very artistic himself. He enjoyed drawing and painting, so they had that in common. Rebecca was also working as a long-distance operator at Ohio Bell Telephone Company at the time. The family was living in Dayton, Ohio, and Rebecca also believed in being loyal to her employer, and she stayed with the company for nearly a decade. Then she began working for Time Warner Cable Company as a utility coordinator. Rebecca and Jim were both working parents, doing their best to make ends meet while raising 2 young girls and having fun. Jim enjoyed watching documentaries and playing golf. He loved watching Kentucky basketball, fishing, spending time kayaking with his family, and hanging with good friends. The family also enjoyed traveling together. Heather and Jessica were very close, being only a few years apart, and they did everything together. It was like having a built-in best friend growing up. They both attended Oakview Elementary School, where Jessica was an outstanding student. She was put into the Gifted Students program in 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. Tim Tudor, the gifted program coordinator at the time, said she just got an IQ in the mid-130s, and she was in the upper 3% of kids in her same grade in their district. But the average IQ in the United States is 98, and people generally have IQs between 85 and 115. To give you an example, 98% of people have an IQ below 130. So we're talking about adults here. So that's saying a lot about Jessica when she was in just elementary school level. And according to Psych Central, when I looked into this, your IQ score isn't simply about bragging about how smart you are. Knowing your IQ can help guide a child into beneficial learning programs, pinpoint developmental challenges, and provide insight into global wellness patterns. IQ is also broken down by state. I found a list, so for Ohio it's 100 and the global IQ is around 89. The principal of Oakview described Jessica as just a sweetheart of a kid. She was pretty intelligent, very cheerful, witty, and just a neat kid. And she stood out not just because of her intelligence, but she was also very talented when it came to music. She played the violin, the piano, and the clarinet. They do say that playing instruments positively influences your IQ, and research does show it can be raised by an average of 7 points. And Jessica could also sing. Her maternal grandfather, George Smetley, and her paternal grandpa, also named George, were amazed by how talented Jessica was. He said ever since she was a little girl, she would sit around and talk with adults. She was more advanced for her age. And when Jessica wasn't excelling in math or studying hard to maintain her gifted status at school, she was just an ordinary kid. She enjoyed dancing, acting, and doing gymnastics. The family lived in an apartment complex at the time, and it was filled with other children her age. She became best friends with a little girl named Rudabeh Azadi, who immigrated to the U.S. from Iran. Jessica was the first to befriend her. They met in the apartment community, and they loved dancing together to routines they made to Madonna's music, and they would spend summers playing together all day long. Rudabeh's parents adored Jessica. She was very respectful and sweet to their daughter, very accepting, and not to mention smart and witty. She was a good role model for Rudabeh. They would invite her over to enjoy Persian meals all the time, and Jessica took genuine interest in their culture. She loved Persian food and was curious about their traditions. She would actually sit fascinated when Rudabeh was doing her Persian homework. She was really into it because it was different and exotic to her. After elementary school, she attended Kettering Junior High School, but only until the 7th grade because, unfortunately, Jessica's mom and dad decided to get a divorce. It was a tough decision, but it was the right one for them at the time. Now, Rebecca's family lived back in Columbus, Ohio, which was about an hour away. It's still not too far for Jessica to go back and visit. Jim and Heather, yes, Heather was staying back with her dad. Heather was already in the middle of high school, so it seemed like a better plan to have her stay with Jim to finish up where she was. She had dreams of working in the medical field, so academic stability was important to her and her parents. Rebecca and Jessica moved from Kettering to Columbus in 1988 when Jessica was 13 years old. They would now be closer to Rebecca's parents, George and Ruth. At first, Rebecca was concerned with Jessica switching schools, but she had done so well academically in the past. She thought it would be just fine, and she was right. Jessica adapted very well when she went into the 8th grade in Columbus, Ohio. She made friends very easily because of her loving, outgoing personality. She liked hanging out and having fun with her friends, but she was also very dedicated to her studies. She was the type of student that could skim over the lesson and still be able to get an A, whereas many of the other students had to study really hard, even for little pop quizzes. Her IQ and her gifted classes in the past probably helped. By the time 9th grade came around and she was a freshman at Columbus Westland High School, Jessica already knew that she wanted to become a zoologist. And this was because of the love she had for animals. She was going to work hard to get into college and study veterinary medicine. That meant dedicating even more time to her schoolwork because she wanted to earn a scholarship. She worked hard to maintain a 4.0 average and was always on the honor roll. Well, while all the serious work was going on, another passion was forming in Jessica because of her bubbly and fun personality. She was drawn to cheerleading. She had been a gymnast as a child, and she loved acting and dancing, so this came naturally to her. And she made it on the high school football cheerleading squad. This definitely helped her make a lot more friends with all the girls that were on her team. And they had practices together and events, and then of course, the football games that they would have to attend. Her life became a lot more social, not just with girls but also with boys. By the summer going into her sophomore year of high school, She spent time back home in Dayton with her dad, her sister, and her old friends. And she could not stop talking about all the fun she was having with her new friends. Sherry Somm, one of her friends from back in Kettering, felt a little uncomfortable with some of the things that Jessica was telling her. After all, they were only 14 years old, and Jessica was talking about all these stories about how she was hanging out with older teenage boys, even boys that were 18 years old. It sounded like trouble to Sherry, especially when Jessica sort of bragged about staying out late with these boys that she hardly knew. Jessica even told her that she and a friend went hitchhiking, and this concerned Sherry. She knew that Jessica had always been a good girl, but you know what? Sometimes teens go through a rebellious stage. It just seemed to Sherry, with the way that Jessica was describing some of the things that her new friends were doing, that they didn't have many morals. And Sherry wondered what Jessica saw in them. It wasn't just Sherry that felt that way. The same thing happened with another old friend that summer in Kettering, Mindy Sidlow. She and Jessica were hanging out like old times, but something was different. When Jessica was telling Mindy all about her new friends, it seemed like she was getting mixed up with the wrong kind of crowd, the type that liked to stir up trouble. And she worried about Jessica, but she also knew how smart Jessica was, so she figured, you know what, it's just a phase, or she at least hoped so. Maybe her old friends just didn't understand her, but there were ones in her new home in Columbus that definitely did. And one of those friends was Nikki Mabry. Jessica and Nikki had become close over the time that she spent there. It seemed like Nikki understood Jessica, and she liked to have fun. She wasn't so uptight, and they were the typical high school girls, having crushes on boys, hanging out by their lockers, gossiping, and just being girls. Nikki knew how many boys were into Jessica, but Jessica was either super picky or just very focused on school and cheerleading, and boys just weren't a priority to her. By her sophomore year, Nikki, Jessica, and their other friends liked to go to the mall and hang out there on the weekends. The Galleria Mall in Columbus, Ohio was the place to be, dropped off by your parents for a couple of hours while you walked around, socialized, had fun with your friends, either window shopping or actually spending some of your allowance. Many times, they would just eat at the food court and hang out, and a lot of teens from the surrounding areas would go there since there wasn't that much for them to do, being under 21 and not really able to go partying at clubs or drink. They were kind of in between that age. They're not really kids, but they're not yet adults. Nikki and Jessica were at the mall one weekend when a guy, a friend of Nikki's, saw them hanging out and came over to say hello. Nikki's friend had another guy friend with him. His name was Sean Thompson. So both of them were introduced to Jessica that day. Sean was a senior at the time, he was a football player, and he and Jessica hit it off pretty quickly. He had seen her a few times before at football games, and homecoming was right around the corner, so the teens made conversation about all the fun and excitement they would have. Sean was cute, he was popular, he was charming, and he thought Jessica was very attractive, and he wanted to get to know her better. He definitely didn't hide that fact. He was very flirtatious, and soon they were seeing each other more and more. Nikki could tell that Sean boosted Jessica's confidence. She felt good around him. He would make her laugh and smile, and he loved to cater to her. Anytime they hung out, he was just sweet, and they got along so well that they became inseparable. It didn't take long before the two of them were more than friends. Sean was Jessica's first boyfriend. She probably didn't know that she could like something or someone more than the dreams that she'd been chasing all those years, working hard in class. But now she was chasing after Sean. He was all she thought about. She would be daydreaming about him in class, just doodling on her notebook, writing. You know, Jessica loved Sean with hearts, the typical high school crush, puppy love, as some people like to call it, right? But it's real for those who feel it, and many of us can relate. Soon, Sean took priority over everything else going on in her life. School was definitely not on the top of her list of things to do. It's a time when hormones are changing, and at times they're out of control. Jessica had a hard time concentrating, and her grades began to slip as a result. Soon, Sean was all Jessica would talk about with her friends. And as happy as Nikki was for her, she also kind of felt like their friendship took a back seat. It was all about writing love letters, talking about how cute Sean was, and making plans to hang out with him. And Jessica, with this being her first love, thought that she was going to marry him one day, like she was going to be future Mrs. Thompson. Rebecca was busy working for Time Warner Cable at the time, but when she would come home from work and spend time around Jessica, a child that she never used to have to worry about, she started to see things that caught her attention, like a notebook with the name Sean written over it 100 times. But she just thought, you know what? It's a crush. And at her age, surely Jessica wasn't really taking this that seriously. It would probably be another boy's name on a notebook next month. But Jessica was also private about the way she felt, and she didn't share too much with her mom, probably because she knew she wouldn't agree with the things she was doing. It's true, Rebecca is about to find out one thing that infuriated her. Just weeks after they met, it was apparent Jessica was serious about her relationship with Sean. It's where all of her effort was placed now. It was so exciting for her, but that excitement led her to make compromises once her friends and later her mother would not approve of. It started with skipping cheerleading practice. Sean wanted to go to a movie one night, but she had to stay after school, so they wouldn't be able to go until later. But instead, Sean kind of convinced Jessica to skip out on cheerleading. At first, Jessica was really concerned. She wasn't the type to do something like that. But Sean and his friends, they were older, they had a car, and he kind of had that bad boy persona. And he was trying to keep that up, definitely know the type, the cool guy image, and Jessica didn't want to miss an opportunity to hang out with him, so she gave in. Sean didn't take school seriously at all. He didn't care about getting good grades. He was more interested in getting out of high school and being able to do whatever he wanted to do as an adult. But with Jessica being only 15 and him being 18, she had a few years ahead of her before that would be the path she was walking down. But it seemed like Sean wanted to rush that. It started with cheerleading, then with skipping last period, and then skipping more than one class a day, to skipping the entire day of school to hang out with Sean and his friends. Nikki saw Jessica change over the next few months. She was like a different person, but Jessica didn't think anyone would take notice. She thought she could handle it, but people were taking note. This was really unlike her. One night, she even stayed out after her curfew. Rebecca waited up all night for her to come home. She was so worried about her, and when she walked through the door, Rebecca told her it was time they had a talk. She wasn't happy. She confronted Jessica about the fact that she didn't seem to care about anything anymore. She didn't care about cheerleading or school. Nothing seemed to matter these days. And those were the things she used to love and enjoyed doing. So it made Rebecca sad. It seemed like her daughter turned her back on all of the things that shaped her into who she had been working so hard to become. So as Jessica's mom, raising her all on her own, Rebecca just wanted to voice her concerns and to let Jessica know how worried she was. But it seemed like Rebecca's concerns were just another thing to add to the list of things that Jessica really didn't seem to care about. She actually just blew her mom off. She acted like Rebecca was overreacting. It was a school night, and Jessica wasn't studying, so Rebecca asked her, "How are you going to maintain your grades? How are you going to get a scholarship for college?" It's a scary time for a parent when it seems like their child is becoming more independent and they can't even recognize them anymore. I will link that case below, and at the end, it's sad. It's an uncertain time in this in-between phase in children's lives where they're becoming an adult, especially when dating is involved. Jessica got snappy with her mom, and this was one of many of these conversations that didn't help their relationship. Jessica pretty much told her mom to mind her own business, that she knew best, and thought her mom was just standing in the way of her happiness. Rebecca wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to push her too hard because she was scared that she might lose her daughter completely, so she just tried to trust Jessica and see what would happen. Maybe it was just a phase. But Jessica would confide in Nikki and other friends and complain about her mother all the time. Nikki, being a concerned friend, tried to make Jessica see her mom's point. She even said, "I kind of understand where your mom's coming from," and tried to make her see that not everyone had a caring mother like that, and she should be grateful that someone cared about her that much. Nikki was actually confused about why Jessica would get so angry with her mom, but Nikki couldn't get through to her either. She wanted what she wanted, and that was a life with Sean. Well, Sean's life was about to change, and Jessica would have to decide to come along for the ride or to stop in her tracks and decide to take a different path. Sean's grades had dropped. He was skipping school all the time, and eventually, this led to him getting expelled. There were a lot of things going on in his personal life that he had to deal with, and Jessica was being dragged into that by choice. She just wanted to stand by her man, no matter what. And although Jessica had always been intelligent and level-headed, her relationship with Sean changed that. Her feelings took precedence over logic, and then Jessica was getting in her own kind of trouble at school. The principal of the high school reached out to Rebecca to notify her that Jessica was skipping school, that her grades had dropped, and she quit cheerleading. Rebecca was shocked. She had no idea that this was happening. She was furious. This time, Rebecca wasn't so nice about it. They got into a full-blown yelling match, and Rebecca had enough. She knew that all of this started with Sean. Jessica was no longer the well-behaved, sensible teenager she had once been. Jessica had become daring and less inhibited to a fault. The relationship with Sean significantly affected Jessica's personality, and her mom was worried that this newfound recklessness would lead to even more trouble if she didn't do something about it. She had to stop it, so she forbade her to see Sean. She said, "You can't see him until your grades come up." So Jessica threatened her by saying, "I'm gonna leave." She told her mom that she didn't want to live with her anymore. Rebecca didn't know what to do. She felt like she failed as a parent because she didn't see the signs earlier. She thought maybe she could have done something months ago to stop this, but Jessica just threw a fit, telling her mom she hated her to get out of her life. She really couldn't see the damage that she was doing, not only to her future, but to her mom, who cared about her so much. Like many teens, Jessica found it difficult to reconcile her mother's behavior with the image of a mom who was only trying to protect her daughter. This entire plan to keep her from Sean ended up backfiring, of course. Call it forbidden love or star-crossed lovers, but this only made Jessica run faster into Sean's arms. She told her mom she was going to be with him no matter what, and she couldn't stop her. Rebecca was also in fear for her daughter's safety. She's a sophomore in high school at the time. She had so much to learn. She's not an adult, and legally she can't decide anything on her own yet, so it was actually Rebecca's responsibility to do something. But she needed help. She tried what she could for the next few months. She tried reasoning with Jessica, taking things away, not letting her have privileges, but nothing worked. And after she exhausted all of her resources, Rebecca reached out to a guidance counselor at Westland High School for assistance. She told the counselor that she and Jessica were at odds all the time. Their arguments were escalating, and she was losing control. The counselor was more than happy to help and provided very useful advice that Rebecca was able to put into action right then and there. They offered counseling sessions for mother and daughter at a place called Huckleberry House. This is a teen crisis center. It's located in the inner city of Columbus. The center provided a variety of resources depending on what a child needed, from just doing counseling sessions to in-house programs where a teen could stay overnight for a specific period of time. It was a safe haven for teens like Jessica, who needed someone to talk to and guide them through these difficult times. I looked, and they're still in operation today. They offer a 24-hour teen crisis hotline for youth and their families. The website says they help Central Ohio youth who are struggling with homelessness, family conflict, poverty, and violence. It says that it's just a safe place where you can stay for a night or two. You can expect to find a no-judgment zone where the goal is to keep you safe and start sorting out the issues in a way that respects your needs and your unique situation. It's a temporary place for teens to stay. They get hot meals, a warm bed, and access to necessities like clothing and hygiene products. And the best part is, they have professionals who are ready and willing to listen and help. I watched a video outlining what they do there, and there's a lot of activities for teens. There's sports. They have a very welcoming staff and like-minded people, and teens that room together and bond. They even do things like chores and help out, and then, of course, get professional assistance that they need. In Jessica's case, after she was evaluated and they understood the situation, it was concluded she would benefit from a 24-hour crisis shelter program where she would stay at the Huckleberry House temporarily and learn skills necessary to resolve the conflicts that she was having at home, including individual counseling and sessions with her mom and a therapist. This was the last resort for Jessica and her mom. Yet after a long discussion, they concluded that taking time apart and having a cooling-off period was the best thing to do. So Rebecca enrolled Jessica in an intensive 2-week program on March 4th, 1991. And even though Jessica was not pleased with this arrangement, she eventually understood how important it was and the positive impact it would have on her life. She was finally seeing the bigger picture, and she was still allowed to have phone calls with friends and, of course, with Sean, so she felt like it would be okay. And she was determined to make the most of her time there. Maybe her mom would even end up seeing her point of view. After just a few sessions together, it was already becoming very beneficial for both of them. They had a safe place where they could express their concerns in a healthy way, get emotional. They could show how much they cared about one another when they weren't at each other's throats and having these screaming matches. While there, Jessica was working to bring up her grades, and she was also getting back into activities that she used to love. It seemed like this was going very well. Her stay was set to end on Friday, March 15th, so the very next day, on Saturday, she would be released and could go back home. She was excited. She wanted to be free and, of course, hang out with Sean again. 2 weeks may not seem that long, but when you're young, it can seem like a lifetime, and she was doing the best while counting down the days. Rebecca was so happy that Jessica would be back home. She was so proud of her. Jessica had shown a lot of maturity by being open to the whole idea of having counseling sessions together. Their final one was Friday afternoon. It was just one day until Jessica was back. Rebecca had calmed down. She wasn't angry anymore, and she was looking forward to their future together. She could have never imagined what would happen next, definitely not Jessica herself. There was one thing that wasn't going well while she was stuck at the Huckleberry House. Those 2 weeks made her and Sean drift apart. They were used to seeing a lot more of one another, and now that Sean wasn't in school, he wasn't doing high school stuff anymore. He was even more independent, and without being around Jessica, he started to realize how good that freedom felt. It created tension in the relationship. Sean was going out and having fun with his friends, while Jessica was stuck in a teen center. She may have been there for him no matter what, but when the tables were turned, it didn't seem like Sean had put his life on pause for her. She called him that Friday afternoon. She was excited to let him know, "I'm coming home. I'm getting out the next day." But Sean didn't know what that meant for them anymore, and Jessica was confused. Sean told her that things just felt different between them. It was like he moved on, and this made Jessica really anxious. It seemed like Sean was sick of being blamed for Jessica's issues, and as much as he loved her, he thought it would be best if they broke up. Can you imagine what must have been going on in this 15-year-old's mind? This is her first boyfriend, this is her life. Jessica still had 2 more years of high school, and it was clear her mother didn't like Sean, but Jessica begged him, "Please don't break up with me." She was really scared and upset, especially when he told her that he was going with some friends to the mall and then to a party. She didn't want him to go without her. She was so desperate to see him, so she told him, "You know what, I'll meet you at the mall in like 20 minutes. It was close to 6 p.m. at the time, but the mall wasn't that far from the Huckleberry House. It was actually only a 5-minute drive, a 20-minute bus ride, but it was a 47-minute walk, so she'd definitely take the bus, which she was used to doing all the time, and it was only a 1-minute walk to the bus stop, located on East 8th Avenue and Summit Street. You can see it right here on the map. It's actually right around the corner. It was her last evening there, but she couldn't let Sean slip away. She wanted to get to the mall as soon as possible. All the while, Rebecca was preparing for Jessica to come home the next day. She had no idea that she just skipped out of the Huckleberry house to go hang out with the boy who started all this drama to begin with. It was getting later, and some nights while Jessica was at the Huckleberry house, she would call her mom to say goodnight, and sometimes her mom would call her. But that night, neither one of them did, and Rebecca just felt like, you know what, there's so much to do. I'm getting the house ready. I'm gonna see her in the morning, so they could both get a good night's sleep and not bother one another. As it got later and Rebecca was getting into bed, she assumed Jessica had been asleep for a while already, safe at the Huckleberry house. But she was about to find out that wasn't the case, not at all. The Huckleberry house had an 11 p.m. head count, and when the RAs were making their rounds, they couldn't locate Jessica. It was close to midnight when Rebecca was woken up by the phone ringing. It was someone from Huckleberry house informing her that Jessica was not accounted for, and Rebecca was furious. All the hard work that they had both put in, and she runs off, most likely to go see Sean. She can't believe it. She tells the Huckleberry house she thinks she knows where she is. Rebecca figures this is just another one of Jessica's little games. Rebecca's thinking that in Jessica's mind she thinks, I'm coming home the next day, so hell with this whole plan. I made nice long enough, and now it's time to do what I want and not see Sean. So now it's Rebecca's mission to find her daughter. She's calling all of Jessica's friends, asking if they'd heard or seen from her that day, and they said they hadn't. And it was late, so Rebecca wasn't going to call that many people. She just figured at some point she would get a call from Jessica asking to be picked up and apologizing. Rebecca went back to bed, anticipating Jessica's call, but it never came. The next morning, Rebecca expected to hear from her daughter, but she didn't, so she really started to worry. She thought maybe Jessica had finally followed through on the threat she used to say that she was going to run away from home. Rebecca decided to call some of her friends over, and they agreed to go around the town, all different places where they knew Jessica might be, and try to locate her. But none of them could, so they banded together at Rebecca's house to offer her support. She had tried a number of times to contact Sean, but he never answered or returned her calls. Rebecca was trying hard to understand what may have been happening. Why would Jessica not come home? It wasn't like her to stay out overnight. It would be one thing for her to come home late, but this had never happened. So she figured, you know what, maybe she's scared to come home. Maybe she thinks she's gonna get in trouble. Maybe she fell asleep when she was out with Sean. She didn't get a chance to come home, and now she's fearful to go back to the Huck house because she left the way that she did. So finally, Rebecca called the police, but to them, it was looking like Jessica was a runaway. They see it all too often. A teen gets in arguments with their parents, they're sent to Huckleberry house, they get some independence, and they choose to run away instead of coming home. They needed Rebecca to calm down and wait. Well, you don't have to demand to report your minor child missing. There's number 48-hour rule, but back then, Rebecca didn't know any better. She thought that the cops knew best. Meanwhile, she decided to do only things she could right now, and that was to write a letter to God. She said, even if Jessica doesn't come home for yet another night, just please let me know she's okay. But Jessica wasn't okay. The next day was Sunday, March 17th, a little after noon. A young photography student was exploring a place called Foster Chapel Cemetery and taking photographs when she saw something in the distance. It didn't look right. She kept snapping pictures, and she was getting closer and closer, trying to figure out what it was that she was looking at through her viewfinder. She thought it might be a person sleeping in the grass, so she called out to them, but they didn't answer. She took a few more steps towards them in their direction, and it was clear that the person was not clothed. Then she realized they were covered in blood. She had just stumbled upon a deceased person in a cemetery. That must have been terrifying and confusing. So many thoughts were probably running through her mind. Is this a person who was dug up by someone? What is going on? Frantic, the college student fled. She went to go find a phone, called 911, and told them everything she just saw. Sheriff Jim Sabin from Madison County Sheriff's Office, along with prosecutor Steve Prone, responded to that call. They were told the approximate location of the body. It was in the southeast corner of the cemetery. So they made their way over to that area. Officer Sabin located a nude female lying about 20 feet from a grave and close to a wire fence. Her body was partially hidden by a gravestone. Prosecutor Prone took a look and was mortified by what he saw. He said it could only be described as sickening. There was blood everywhere, and it was actually the condition of her face and her head that was the most horrific. Her face had been beaten until it wasn't even a face anymore. It was obvious how violent this attack was. Her upper body was covered in slashes, abrasions, and bruises. She had nothing on but a tangled and twisted bra that was kind of hanging off her chest and one single muddy white sock on one of her feet. As they scanned the immediate area, they didn't see her clothing nearby. No pants, no shirt or underwear were present in the area, and as they looked around preliminarily, they could see footprints in the soft, muddy ground, footprints that they knew were probably made by their victim. She didn't have a wallet or a purse, so there was no way to identify her. But by the look of the body, from what they could tell, she appeared to be in her early 20s, possibly younger. They couldn't be sure. Homicide and crime scene investigators were called in. They decided to work backward to figure out how she got to this resting place. They wanted to attempt to retrace her path through the cemetery. This was a very rural area, not a place where just anyone would usually find themselves. It was about 20 miles from Columbus, out in the middle of nowhere. All that was around was farmland. The homes were very sparse, scattered across acres and acres of land, with the closest one being about a quarter of a mile away. They wondered who she was and how she got there. This area is actually called Plain City, and that is fitting. It's one of the most rural areas I think I've seen in a case that I've covered so far. Just as far as how empty it is, how there's just farmland as far as the eye can see. Just look at it. So for someone to be found in a place like this, so far from this city, it was challenging to figure out. So they began at the scene. Where had she come from, and where did the altercation begin? As they worked backward, following her footprints, they saw impressions in the soft soil behind a tombstone. It looked like they were made with knees or elbows, as though she was in a crouched position, hiding behind these graves. They found these impressions by several other tombstones. They believed that she was using them to take cover from an attacker. Each one was closer and closer to the front of the cemetery. And as they got closer to the entrance, they saw yet another white sock laying in the grass next to a cement driveway that comes through the cemetery. The sock was dirty and matched the one that the victim had on her other foot. They also noticed that it contained little rocks and yellow paint chips, which indicated to investigators that this woman had been running from the roadway. They were standing even closer now to the front of the cemetery when they saw something. A piece of gray duct tape stuck to the top of one of the gravestones, and there were long strands of hair still sticking to it. They kept making their way, following each clue, until they saw another one on a wooden fence in the front of the cemetery. It actually looked like muddy handprints, the ones that would be left if someone climbed over the fence to get inside. They thought that this is where the victim made entry. But where did she come from? The footprints went through a ditch beside the roadway, and clearly she wasn't familiar with the cemetery, because if she were, she would know, you don't need to climb over a fence to get inside. There was an entrance big enough to drive right through it, and it wasn't that far away. But then again, it was apparent she was running from an attacker or attackers, making quick, in-the-moment decisions. The trail pretty much goes cold once they've reached the roadway. It's called Georgeville Road. This led the investigators to believe that she came here by car, either by force, or she ran or escaped out of a vehicle on this roadway. They don't really have that much to go on. They doubt anyone would have been anywhere nearby and would have heard anything or seen anything. Their theory is that she was running from her assailant and jumped over the fence in the dark, not even realizing it was a cemetery. And she attempted to flee but ended up being attacked before she could get away. There was no question this poor girl was running for her life. It was probably very confusing for her to navigate these surroundings, the dark, ancient tombstones, derelict mausoleums. It added to the sense of terror, even to the investigators who were used to very violent scenes. They felt a chill as they were looking through the grounds of the cemetery for clues. There is just nothing out there at night. It would be pitch black. There's no lamppost or street signal, and there's almost nowhere to run and hide. No one would hear you scream, and scarier yet, she was running among the dead. Any screams would have been in vain. They were still scouring the entire cemetery for clues, and that's when they spot something else. The back, near where the victim's body was found, in the far corner of the cemetery. They see two bloody pieces of a large tombstone. It was about 20 inches wide and 30 inches high and 70 pounds, and it's broken in half. They realize they just found the murder weapon. The attacker had actually grabbed this tombstone and pulled it from the soil and used it to beat the victim. That, to me, is just more than terrifying. It's like something you would hear in a horror movie, but this is someone's real life. And some of these graves had been there since the 1700s, so it wouldn't have been difficult to remove a headstone like this. But to think of someone repeatedly bashing it into someone's head and their neck, their face, that's just unbelievable. What kind of monster would do such a thing, and why? Just the thought of what she must have gone through was heartbreaking for me, and of course the investigators. They couldn't help but feel sad, but they had to continue the investigation and use that as fuel. Now I want to tell you the items that were found and sent to the crime lab for analysis. One muddy sock was found near the driveway, as I said, and that contained microfibers and debris. Hair from a wire fence that was just a few feet east of the body. Vegetation from the fence that they wanted to test for blood. A section of a wood fence post that appeared to have blood on it. One gold earring and a white bead collected from the victim's hair. A soil sample that was collected right next to her left foot. Miscellaneous trash that was in the ditch line in front of the cemetery that they wanted to test for prints, just in case. As well as a cowboy boot and broken car parts from the west side of a small bridge in the area. 2 rolls of Kodak Color 100 film. And lastly, they had a piece of gray duct tape with a clump of hair on it that was found on the headstone belonging to Anthony Lee Taylor. They were going to test that for latent prints, hairs, and fibers. They had also bagged both of the victim's hands. Her left hand had microfibers, hair, and debris on it. They also collected the slabs of sandstone tombstone to see if they could pull any fingerprints off of them. No, now Sheriff Sabin is focused on finding out who the victim is. At the same time, news had traveled, and word got out about the body of a young female being found dead in a cemetery out in Madison County. Rebecca was stunned. She was praying it wasn't Jessica, but she called the police to let them know she'd called a couple of days ago and her daughter was still missing. Sheriff Sabin, along with other officers, went over to Rebecca's residence. She gave them a description of her daughter: white, golden brown hair, green eyes, 15 years old. And that was hard for investigators to hear. They knew their victim was young, but 15? They too, of course, were hoping this wasn't her, but the only way they could figure that out was, unfortunately for Rebecca, to look at pictures of the deceased victim. But by that time, the body had been taken to the Franklin County Coroner's Office for autopsy, so the body had been cleaned. That way it was more identifiable. So Rebecca agreed, and she was handed the photographs. And as she was slipping through, she was shocked. She'd never seen anyone in such a horrific state. This victim had black eyes, a busted lip, a huge cut across her chest, and Rebecca said, "No, that is not my daughter." She kept looking, but she just didn't recognize the girl in the pictures. It wasn't Jessica. She just kept shaking her head and saying, "No, this isn't my daughter." But the thing is, Sheriff Sabin had caught a glimpse of a photograph of Jessica as he entered the home. He knew right away the body he found in the cemetery was hers. But sadly, he knew, like many other parents in these moments, Rebecca was in shock, and she was in denial. They needed an alternative person to identify the body as Jessica's. So a family friend went down to the morgue and confirmed it was her. Finally, it had been determined that the murder victim found at the Foster Chapel Cemetery was 15-year-old Jessica Lynn Kean. And eventually this was confirmed through autopsy. Actually, let's go right into that as well. The autopsy report from the Franklin County Coroner's Office, it was performed by Dr. Patrick Fartell. First of all, it was clear that Jessica had been murdered. The type of injuries she sustained could not have been self-inflicted, so the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The cause of death was blunt force impact to the head and neck, specifically a fractured mandible, which is the bottom jaw, a brain bleed from force impacting her head, an injury to the neck and aspiration of blood, choking on her own blood. It was truly sad. Any of those things could have caused her death. It was truly sad. This was a very painful and possibly slow death. It could have been agonizing. It could have gone on for hours, and she most likely suffered all alone until she took her final breath. It's just particularly heinous. And there's more. There was sperm present from a vaginal swab. And something else that I found interesting is that apparently by looking at the semen sample under a microscope, they can get a general window of time when the assault occurred. This is due to the lifespan of sperm, which can live up to about 7 days. They can estimate how long the sperm have been active and look at their mobility at the point they're collected. And I'm not a scientist, I don't know how all this actually works, but later when they're building a timeline of events, this is one of the ways they do it, by looking at the sperm sample. We'll get back to that in a moment. But now they know what the motive could have been. Or was this just something else the perpetrator did because he could, to violate her? But more importantly, they have DNA. This meant they most likely had the killer's DNA. But in 1991, DNA was brand new. It was nothing like it is today at all. The tests that they used to perform were called RFLP. This stands for Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism. This was actually the first DNA profiling technique that was inexpensive enough to be able to be used on a widespread scale to solve crimes with forensic science. So they use these enzymes to break apart the DNA into pieces, and they compare the resulting fragment lengths. That's where it gets its name, but it's very limited. This technique would result in what they call an autoradiogram. And I know you've seen one of these before. It almost looks like a Scantron when you fill it out when you're taking a test, and they have the DNA sequences on them from the suspect so that they can become compared to the sample collected at the crime scene. See this right here? You've probably seen this before. Well, this is how it used to be done, and a scientist would sit there and compare them. I'll show you a better example instead. See, the first strip is the sample collected at the crime scene, and then the 3 on the right are swabs that they took from suspects. Now, look, see how theoretically suspect number 2 matches the sample from the crime scene. Because they match up. That's how this science used to work, to match criminals to the DNA left behind. So that is what they did in this case. They took that semen sample, they got a DNA sequence from it, and they made an autoradiogram. And now they could use it to compare to anyone they thought may have killed Jessica. But that's the thing. This DNA is only good if you have another DNA to compare to. So they need to get their boots on the ground and talk to people close to Jessica and find out if there was anyone that would have wanted to hurt her. First, they speak with Rebecca, who is absolutely devastated. She's beside herself with sadness. She said that this was exactly what she was trying so hard to prevent, and now it actually happened. The first person that she tells investigators that they should look into is Sean Thompson. She gives them all of his information. She tells them he is a black male, he's 18 years old, this is where he lives, this is his phone number, his approximate height and weight, and the last time she knows that he had seen or spoken to Jessica. But she doesn't know much, however. She tells them, "I am certain that Jessica was with Sean the night she disappeared from Huckleberry House." Jessica's sister Heather received the news about her little sister, and she was in complete shock. She said she stood there just moaning in sadness and disbelief. She couldn't even cry. It was just this gut-wrenching feeling, and she couldn't believe this was really happening, that it could actually be true, that her little sister was not only dead, but she had been murdered. How and why? Those were the questions that kept being repeated by everyone, even the investigators, of course. Jessica had barely lived in Columbus 2 years, so most of her closest friends were back in her old town where she grew up. And when they were given the news of the murder, they were all heartbroken. But not all of them were shocked. There were some that told investigators they knew something like this was going to happen. Remember the friends that she saw during the summer? One of them was Sherry. She mentioned to the police that she had been worried about Jessica ever since she told her about her new friend group and the hitchhiking and the recklessness. It all concerned Sherry, and she felt like nothing good was going to come out of it. And now her childhood friend is dead, and she points investigators toward Jessica's new friend group. Then Mindy comes forward and she repeats the same concerns, that Jessica was mixed up with the wrong crowd, and now look what happened. Remember whom Jessica befriended at the apartment complex as a child? Well, she and her mother were stunned. Her mother, Maisie, said that Jessica was smart and intelligent and beautiful, and that this was a disaster. And Rutabaga said that when they were young, your parents tell you that bad things can happen, but you don't believe them. When this happens to someone you love, it teaches you to be fearful. And that was the current that was running through this whole case. Fear. And it seemed many people close to Jessica were fearful of her new friend group, specifically her boyfriend, Sean. So that's who authorities wanted to talk to. But conveniently, Sean was nowhere to be found. The next stop was Huckleberry House, where investigators were informed that the last time the staff had seen Jessica was 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon. All the teens were interviewed, and many of them echoed the same sequence of events. That Jessica came there in early March. She stayed for about 2 weeks, and over the course of her time there, she spoke with the other teens about her boyfriend, Sean, who she was also on the phone with every day. And the day she disappeared, however, they said that Sean and Jessica had been arguing a lot lately, mainly over her not being able to see him. They wanted to get together so they could discuss things and see if they could work them out. On her last day there, she was on the phone with Sean towards the evening. All of a sudden, they heard her start to argue with him. She was visibly upset and eventually began to cry and to beg Sean not to break up with her. When she got off the phone, she told one of the other teens that was present that she and Sean had broken up, but that she was going to meet him at the mall, and then she left. As the investigators canvassed the surrounding area, a witness who also stayed at the Huckleberry House said that they saw Jessica at the bus stop around 6 p.m. Friday evening. It's the one I showed you earlier, on the corner of Summit Street and East 8th Avenue. This was all the information they had to build out a timeline of events prior to her murder. She was never seen by anyone after 6 p.m. that night, and she was on her way to meet up with Sean, who they now know had been arguing with her. And apparently there were whispers about a gold necklace with the word "taken" on it that Sean had given Jessica. She always wore it, and the word was spreading about how it was never found at the crime scene, which was true. It hadn't been found. New articles were coming out every day with interviews from different teens that Jessica had been friends with, which ended up leading to even more new articles that spun the narrative in the direction of accusing Jessica's mom of not liking Sean because he was black and Jessica was white. However, not only did Rebecca clear the air on this, but so did many of Jessica's friends, including Nikki. They said Jessica never mentioned that as a reason her mom was upset. They said Rebecca's dislike for Sean had to do with the way that Jessica behaved after the two started dating, his age, and the fact that he left school. It had nothing to do with his race. Carissa Hill, a 14-year-old friend of Jessica's in Columbus, said yeah, Sean was the issue, but her mom disapproved because Sean was a bad influence on Jessica. Of course, we can never get inside Rebecca's mind, But this was the first guy Jessica had ever dated, so I think no matter what it was, the fact she was dating a guy and that he took precedence over everything else. Rebecca had told Jessica that if she could get her grades up, she could see him, but Jessica just kept acting more and more irresponsible. It was hard in this moment, when her daughter was murdered, not to hate Sean, who she blamed for tearing her daughter away from her and probably ending her life. She definitely did not have positive things to say about him. He was still nowhere to be found. And a girl named Danielle Gillenwater, a 15-year-old friend of Jessica's, told the investigators that Sean had actually left town with a friend. He was in Florida. And then she added, he doesn't even know Jessica's dead. Well, that was debatable. But now they had a bulletin out from Ohio down to Florida. Officers would now be on the lookout for a car matching the description of the one that Sean and his friend left in. Apparently, Sean decided to skip town right before Jessica's body had been found, and after 6 p.m. on Friday night, when she was on her way to meet him. Clearly, this was seen as a blatant attempt to evade authorities. Florida is a prime location to get out of the country as well, so they were still looking for him. By the 28th of March, almost 2 weeks after Jessica's body had been found, he and his buddy got pulled over in Georgia. They detained both of them and started questioning them, and ultimately they brought them back to Ohio for more in-depth interrogation, as well as DNA swabs. This is when Sean was informed that Jessica had been killed, and he was in total shock. It truly didn't seem like he had a clue about what happened, but he had almost 2 weeks to practice this response. They asked him why he fled Ohio, and he explained there were a few reasons. First of all, he and his friends decided it was time to take a spring break vacation to Florida, which was a very common location for many teens and college students at the time. It still is today, but back in the 90s, it was the place for spring break. It was the spring break capital, but he also said he wanted to leave Ohio because he had been arrested for burglary, and he was trying to avoid a court date that he had. That didn't look good for him, but he promised that he wasn't trying to flee because of anything related to Jessica. But he told them he had been trying to distance himself from her because he didn't want to be the cause of all the friction between her and her mom. He felt that they would be better off breaking up, and they had broken up on Friday evening. He did wait around at the mall for a while, but she never showed up, so he just figured she couldn't leave the Huckleberry house. His ride was finally leaving, and he left with his friends. But he insisted that he had nothing to do with her murder, and he gave a sample of his DNA, and so did his friend. That friend was 19-year-old George Cole. He had caught the eye of detectives. Despite the fact that he was pretty young, George had an extensive criminal record. He had been arrested multiple times and charged with various offenses, ranging from petty theft to vandalism to other crimes. His record was a sign of trouble, and it piqued the detectives' interests. During their interviews, the detectives learned there had been arguments between George and Jessica in the past, but they would have to wait another 2 weeks to get those DNA results back. Meanwhile, results from other pieces of evidence were finally back from the crime scene. Unfortunately, no fingerprints were able to be taken off of that bloody slab of tombstone that had been used to bludgeon Jessica. The sandstone that was used to make these tombstones back then was very rough and porous, and it was too difficult to test for prints. There were also no fingerprints on the duct tape and no evidence from the socks that they found. But then a tip comes in about Sean's friend George. Allegedly, he had been walking around town bragging about killing Jessica. One person claimed he threatened to do the same thing that he did to the girl in the graveyard. After the detectives received these tips, they called George back in. But during his interview, yes, he admits, "I made those disturbing remarks, but I said it because I wanted to impress my friends and enhance my image." Let me ask you, what kind of person thinks that that's impressive? Before they could even dive in any further, something big happens. A clue comes in from a local resident of Madison County. He had been driving down that same road in front of the cemetery late on Friday night, actually in the middle of the night, past midnight. He said he saw a car in the middle of the road with its headlights on, but it wasn't moving. So he decided to park behind it, get out of his truck, and walk over to see if someone was in need of assistance. As he gets closer, he realizes the driver's door is wide open and the keys are still inside, and the car's running, but no one's in there. He looked in the back seat. Nothing. It was just really unusual. Now, this wasn't in front of the cemetery, though. It was before you come up on the cemetery, several hundred yards from it. This meant if Jessica had been screaming from the cemetery at this point, this man who was standing at the roadside most likely wouldn't have been able to hear her. It was just too far away. However, investigators now believe that this was the car that Jessica was in prior to her death, and the person driving was probably the killer. The resident that observed the car didn't stay that much longer because there wasn't much for him to do. As weird as it was, something to note is that this area would have been the perfect place to hurt someone and hide their body, not in the cemetery, but actually right here, Prairie Oaks hiking trail. Yes, indeed, look at this place. There is a road that leads right to the trail from Georgeville Road, and once you're on that trail, there are so many very dense wooded areas and a number of bodies of water. It would be very hard to find a person's remains in this location, and it could have been where the killer intended to take Jessica before she was able to escape and run into that cemetery. We don't know where they were coming from, but the resident said the car was parked several hundred feet north of the cemetery, and the hiking trail would have been on that road right past the cemetery. The hiking trail is only a quarter of a mile from the southeast portion of that cemetery where Jessica's body was found. Not to mention, the killer could have planned to pull over anywhere along this road and cause her death, and then dispose of her in this field or drive to the trail after she was deceased. That actually could have been what was happening when he pulled the car over before it reached the cemetery. A struggle that Jessica was somehow able to break free from long enough to run as fast as she could. We know she had duct tape on her somewhere because a piece of it ended up on a gravestone, and because there was hair on it, the investigators believed that that specific piece of duct tape found at the scene had been over Jessica's mouth to keep her from screaming. But she could have had it on her wrists, and she was able to break free from it and left it in the car. She probably realized that this man had a plan, and it wouldn't end with her being able to walk away and talk about it. We will never know exactly what happened in those moments, but what detectives do know now is that Sean Thompson's DNA results came back, and they were shocking. They did not match the swab taken from Jessica at the crime scene, and his friend's DNA didn't match either. They both had alibis, and they checked out as well. All along, Jessica's mom kept saying she was certain that Jess was with Sean that night. "Aunt, you can't be certain of anything unless you truly have proof." The proof the investigators had was scientific evidence. It had ruled Sean out. In that semen sample, they were able to give them a timeline of when the first attack on Jessica took place. Judging by the declaration of the oldest sperm, they placed the assailant and Jessica together and having forced intercourse around 7:30 or 8 p.m. when Sean was at the mall and left to go to a party with friends. This was only about 30 minutes to an hour after she was last seen at the bus stop, with no proof that she even stepped foot on a bus. When news of Jessica's murder spread throughout Columbus, tips started coming in. One caller reported finding a pair of sneakers north of the cemetery on the road. This information was taken very seriously, and the police department assigned officers to investigate these tips. Detectives received a call from someone else who had discovered a pair of jeans near the interstate ramp to I-70, traveling eastbound. Upon investigation, the detectives concluded that the jeans and the sneakers were Jessica's, but they didn't understand why Jessica's belongings were found so far from the crime scene at the cemetery. The clothing was nowhere near the mall or the Huckleberry house either. And as they're looking through all this clothing, the detectives find 2 bus tickets and 2 transfer stickers in the back pocket of Jessica's jeans. This led them to believe that she never boarded the bus. She traveled frequently by bus, and she would have previously purchased a book of paper bus passes that she could use to get from one place to another, like the Huckleberry House, back home, to school. And they believe she had brought enough to get to and from the mall and Huckleberry House, but never used them. Investigators concluded that Jessica had been abducted from the bus stop. Now they needed to find out who took her. Nikki told them that they never got into a car with someone unless they knew them. She said there could be a chance that maybe it was somebody Jessica knew, or kind of knew. Maybe it wasn't a really good friend, but someone she was familiar enough with that she trusted them to get in their car, not knowing what would ultimately happen. But she was so desperate to see Sean that night. She wanted to get to him as soon as she could because he had broken up with her and he was about to go out and have fun without her. So investigators think that someone drove up and offered Jessica a ride to the mall. And unfortunately, the urgency to see Sean made Jessica compromise her safety. Amon Costello, the assistant prosecutor at the time, said, "Imagine being picked up, thinking that this kind, Good Samaritan is doing you a favor and taking you to the shopping mall, but instead, you're taken 30 minutes away and attacked repeatedly. Then, after dark and you've been held captive for hours, you're driven out to rural Madison County, knowing this man is not going to leave you out there alive." He went on to say she had no way to protect herself. All she could do was try to punch, hit, and kick this man. Jessica was athletic and feisty. Her family called her a fighter, so there was no doubt in people's minds that she put up quite a fight. We know that she was somehow able to break free and get out of that car, but this was before we had cell phones, and in this area, there were no streetlights, let alone a payphone. The only thing you could do was find a house and knock on their door, praying they're going to answer and let you use the phone to call 911. Now that the detectives have a theory, they go back to the evidence in the crime scene, trying to put together what they think happened after Jessica jumped out of that car. From what they gathered, they think that she managed to get out of the restraints, open the passenger's door, and run. She probably had no idea she was running into that cemetery, but she had no choice. She was desperately trying to find a place to hide, and she used the gravestones to conceal her from her attacker. The investigators go back at night, and they look at what Jessica would have seen, and they notice they can see a farmhouse in the distance. Jessica probably saw that house too. It wasn't that close by, but it was the only one around, and it could have had a light on. So she did the smart thing and made a run for it. The thing is, she didn't realize in the dark that the cemetery had a fence around the sides. It wasn't as visible as the one she jumped over in the front. It was a wire fence with wooden posts. She probably waited and rested behind one of the gravestones. She saw her attacker was far enough away that she could gain some distance from him, and she made a run for it towards that farmhouse. She ran with all of her might, only to be stopped dead in her tracks by slamming into one of the wooden posts at full speed. They believe this is what happened because her hair was actually tangled up in the wires in the fence right in front of where they found her body. She could have been knocked unconscious by the force, only to have her attacker catch up with her and callously end her life. It's truly sad. She had nowhere to go. Everyone wanted answers. Meanwhile, they have to prepare for Jessica's funeral. Heather lived 70 miles away, but as soon as she heard that news, she raced home to be with her mother. When Heather eventually arrived, she found Rebecca shaking and crying. There were just so many unanswered questions. Heather and Rebecca needed to focus on preparing for Jessica's funeral, so that's what they did. It wasn't really Rebecca, though, because nobody could console her. The thought of her daughter being gone forever was too much. She couldn't help but feel responsible for Jessica's death in some way. So Jessica's sister, Heather, only being a teenager herself at the time, had to take on this task of planning her baby sister's funeral. Heather had to make all the arrangements herself, including picking out Jessica's casket, which was a heartbreaking experience for such a young person. Hundreds of people had gathered to pay their respects to Jessica and her family. On the day of her funeral, Jessica was laid to rest in the peaceful grounds of Sunset Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. and Jessica may have finally been able to rest, but her family and detectives were not. Jessica's family knew that the longer the investigation went on without an arrest, the smaller the chance was that they'd ever solve her murder. The experience was so traumatic for her entire family. Rebecca said she became obsessed with finding her daughter's killer. She checked in with the detectives all the time to see if any progress had been made. She was also paranoid whenever she saw a strange guy. She couldn't help but wonder, was that man who killed Jessica? Her mind was consumed with getting justice for her daughter, and I don't blame her. But for years, Jessica's murder had been an ongoing mystery that eluded detectives. Her case had become so perplexing that it eventually appeared on the popular TV show, Unsolved Mysteries. On the show, Rebecca was actually interviewed, and she talked about how she could almost imagine the way Jessica would have felt, being so scared that night, her heart pounding, hiding behind those gravestones, praying to Jesus to save her. Rebecca also said that she doesn't seek revenge. She believes only God has the right to take a life. However, if someone did this and got away with it, Rebecca did fear that they would do it again. She said that Unsolved Mysteries was their last chance to find out who killed Jessica. Unfortunately, it never brought any tips that led them to the killer. 5 years went by, and in May of 1996, they still hadn't arrested anyone, and the case went cold. Sheriff Sabin enlisted the help of Special Agent Greg Costas of the BCI, and he took on the case. But he got very emotionally involved, even though he was a veteran detective, and that was because Jessica was so young. But he started from the beginning as though he had been put on the case from day one. He went back through all the information and re-interviewed everyone, including Mr. Sean Thompson and his friend, George Cole. And that's when he finds out they weren't alone on that Florida trip. They went with 4 other guys, so they had to track them down and interview them. They had never even been spoken to all of those years, so that's a start right there. And he gets DNA from all 4 of them. He polygraphed all 6 of them because none of them had ever even taken a polygraph. And guess what? Nothing matched. None of their DNA matched, and they all passed the polygraphs. It was another dead end. Over the years, the Dayton Daily News had been running Crime Stopper ads. They were asking for tips and offering a $100,000 reward, but the detectives received no credible leads. Again, time ticks by. It's March of 2001, the 10th anniversary of Jessica's murder, and still, they have no answers. One big change, though, was that CODIS had been formed since the murder. It's the Combined DNA Index System, and that's exactly what it is. It's a system that combines all the DNA samples of all the criminals so they can track them nationwide and see if their DNA links to any other cases. Well, during the time that Special Agent Costas took over the case, he wanted to submit that semen sample into CODIS. Now, they knew there wasn't a guarantee that the killer's DNA would be in their system, because for that to have happened, he would have had to commit another violent crime and then been caught since 1991, when Jessica's murder had occurred. But many times, when someone commits one crime like this, they're bound to be a repeat offender, so it was worth a try. However, they got some devastating news. Remember that old way I told you about the RFLP? Well, it wouldn't be able to be read by their new system. That was so disappointing. They had an entirely new technique for DNA profiling. It was called STR, short tandem repeat. It's more accurate. So even though they had this full DNA profile, it would be like having something in a different language that couldn't be interpreted. It was obsolete, and therefore it was worthless to them. And not only that, the worst part was the old DNA testing method had used up the swab. That swab had been used to get the DNA from inside Jessica's body. It's like a long Q-tip that has a cotton part at the end. Well, it was used up and it was thrown away, so now they really didn't even have the killer's DNA. Several more years go by. It had been 15 years since Jessica's murder. Agent Costas literally resubmitted every piece of evidence, just crossing his fingers and hoping that something had usable DNA on it. Still, nothing. However, forensic scientist Max Larangiani was assigned to do whatever he could. There was a lot of pressure put on this man. He was told that this was the oldest unsolved case in their backlog, and it had no suspects. He really wished that the previous team hadn't used up that swab of semen, but then he finds something. When the original DNA vaginal swab was taken, it was stored in a vial, and even though the swab was completely gone, the bottle, the vial, it was still in their possession. Scientist Larangiani thought that this was a long shot, but perhaps some of the sperm had rubbed off on the sides or the bottom of this vial. So he took another sterile swab and he swabbed the inside all over. He knew that most likely it wouldn't yield anything, but he only needed a minuscule amount. He knew that in his hands he had the vial that the original item was in contact with, but he was holding his breath. He was just hoping something would come up, but he wasn't expecting it, especially since this had been sitting in storage for 17 years by this time. He put what he swabbed onto a glass slide and looked at it under a microscope, and he said he actually gasped because there was a single sperm cell there. And that's all he needed. That is amazing. It is unbelievable. And now he has a DNA profile of the killer that they can actually enter into CODIS. Can you even imagine how that must have felt? But now they have to wait. At 10:11 a.m. March 17th, 2008, 17 years to the exact day that Jessica Kean's body was found in that cemetery, Sheriff Sabin got a phone call saying that they got a hit on the DNA sample that they submitted. Sometimes it's almost as though there's some kind of unseen, powerful force besides science for this timing to be so perfect. But they have a name, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. It's a name of a person that has never been on their radar. They do a background check, and they find out Marvin had a history of violence, especially towards women. He had been convicted of the R-word, forced sexual intercourse, and many other criminal offenses in the past. And not only that, there was one crime that stood out to them. One of the offenses that Marvin had been convicted of was against a young woman that he picked up at a bus stop. Marvin fit the profile of the type of person that would have done this to Jessica. And guess what? On August 1991, just 5 months after Jessica's murder, Marvin had been sentenced to 3 years in the Ohio Correctional System at the London, Ohio facility. This was only a mile and a half away from the Madison County Sheriff's Office and right next to the BCI building. So all that time when they were looking for the killer, he was essentially right there in such close proximity. But that was all before CODIS, and the states at the time didn't require DNA samples from inmates. He was incarcerated until 1995, and then he moved to North Carolina. He probably thought that he got away with it. But in April of 2000, he decided to violate his parole because he didn't want to attend counseling for sexual predators, so he was sent back to Ohio for 30 days. And at that time, they collected a DNA sample when he was incarcerated. So essentially, detectives could have gotten a hit years ago had the DNA sample in Jessica's case been retested back then, but they might not have had the same technology they did in 2008. By the time they got this hit, Marvin had definitely moved on in his life. He was married, had an infant son, and was working at Walmart in North Carolina. He definitely thought he got away with murder. It was easy to track him down. They found him outside his workplace on a smoke break, and they had a warrant for his arrest. They brought him back to Ohio for an interrogation. But knowing that Marvin Smith Jr. could easily claim that he had consensual sex with Jessica and that someone else killed her afterward, the detectives were very cautious about how they approached him. It's basically Agent Costas showing him a picture of Jessica. Of course, he denies knowing her, because this is like, okay, well then how does your semen get inside a woman that you say you've never met? What's the explanation? And Marvin says, I don't know. Costas says, well, we know based on scientific evidence that you had physical contact with this girl. And all Marvin could say was, I can't explain it. Costas was like, right, well the odds are literally 1 in 1 quintillion that someone else other than you had sexual relations with her and left the semen in there. To illustrate this, Costas takes a piece of paper and a pen and writes a 1 with 18 zeros after it. He holds it up and says, Marvin, do you know what this is? He says, that's a lot of zeros. That's when Costas told him, that's the odds that someone other than you left that semen in there. It's better than a fingerprint. It's scientific. and Marvin had nothing else to say. So on May 14, 2008, a Madison County grand jury indicted him for aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape. Investigators believe that on the evening of March 15th, Marvin asked Jessica if she needed a ride to the mall when she was sitting at that bus stop. And once she was inside his car, they think he went somewhere secluded, jumped in the back, and assaulted her numerous times over and over again in the next few hours. Then, at some point, he headed out to that rural area in Madison County and threw Jessica's clothing out the window on the way so that he could dispose of evidence. Jessica was probably aware that he was going to kill her. He may have even told her so. But Jessica managed to get away. She jumped out and ran. She was in an unfamiliar place in the middle of nowhere. It was dark and would have been hard for her to see anything. She ultimately jumped that fence in the cemetery, thinking it could have led to a home or a building, maybe a door that she could have gone through, or a business. But she found herself in a cemetery, and she had to resort to hiding behind gravestones. And by the way, the one piece of duct tape that was hanging on Anthony Lee Taylor's grave, I looked him up, and he had died just a year before at the age of 17. To think that she was using another teen's grave as protection was really chilling and sad. If only she hadn't hit that post on that wire fence, maybe she could have gotten to that farmhouse in the distance, that beacon that called out to her in the darkness, that safe haven. But instead, she fell to her final resting place. Her mother hopes that that fall did render her unconscious, so that she didn't have to be aware of what Marvin, the monster, was doing to her. As the prosecution prepared for trial, they asked for the maximum sentence for Marvin, a death sentence. But Marvin Smith pleaded guilty to all charges just 1 month before trial was set to begin, taking a plea deal, sparing Jessica's family from going through the trial, leaving them with so many questions. Jessica's family had to accept that Marvin Smith Jr. would never have to explain why he killed Jessica. When they saw him in court for the very first time, they described him as non-emotional, scary, and it being an infuriating experience. They hoped to gain some closure, understanding about what happened, but instead, they were just left with questions and a sense of loss. Before the judge sentenced Marvin Smith, Heather and Rebecca spoke on Jessica's behalf. Heather later said it was the most difficult thing she had ever done, but she felt compelled to do it because she wanted to be able to speak on Jessica's behalf, because she couldn't speak for herself. And even though Heather was scared and nervous, she was determined to do what she felt like was the right thing, to be her sister's voice in that courtroom. Rebecca was also overcome with emotion as she spoke to the judge, pleading for justice for her daughter. It was a difficult and emotional day for everyone, but Heather and Rebecca had to remain strong and speak for Jessica. Marvin Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. I'm surprised that he has parole at all. Granted, I know he'll be in his 80s, but he shouldn't get 1 minute to enjoy life outside of a cell again. And while Jessica's family feels that justice has been served, the pain and sadness of their loss still lingers with them. Even in her dreams, Rebecca can still smell Jessica's hair and knows that Jessica will always be with her in her heart and in her memories. She'll never forget her. And in the end, Jessica's sister Heather said that she hoped that this case would give hope to other families that were waiting for justice in finding their loved ones' killers. It's possible, even years later, with modern technology. Sheriff Jim Sabin said that closing this case meant that when he decides to retire, he could retire in peace. When Marvin was sentenced, Jessica's family ripped off bracelets that they had been wearing for years in her memory. Heather wanted this moment to be symbolic, a symbol of the future for her traumatized family, especially her mom. Because Heather was a mom of 3 herself and a pediatric oncology nurse now, Heather said, "I'm a mother now, and I know how painful it was for Rebecca not to be there to protect Jessica and not to know what happened." She hoped this closure would bring peace to her mom and that she could move on, and that it would help Heather to let go of the tragedy and the crime part of all this and remember Jessica how she was. Heather also thanked Special Agent Costas, saying, Ever since he took over the case and never let it go, she felt secure and confident that everything would be done that needed to be done. And Jessica's old friend wrote a thank you note to Costas. It said in part, "Marvin Smith taught me how to fear, and you taught me justice is always possible."